As Oliver finds peace with Miss Maylie and Rose, Fagin and Monks continue plotting against him. Nancy, torn between loyalty and guilt, secretly meets Mr. Brownlow and Rose to reveal Monk's sinister plan to ruin Oliver's life. But Bill Sikes suspects her betrayal, and in a fit of rage, commits a horrific act that sends shockwaves through London's underworld. With danger closing in, Oliver's fate grows ever more uncertain.
Chapter 31 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens involves a critical position. "Who's that?" inquired Brittles, opening the door a little way, with the chain up, and peeping out, shading the candle with his hand. "Open the door," replied a man outside. "It's the officers from Bow Street as was sent today." Much comforted by this assurance, Brittles opened the door to its full width, and confronted a portly man in a greatcoat, who walked in without saying anything more, and wiped his shoes on the mat as coolly as if he lived there. "Just send somebody to relieve my mate, will you, young man?" said the officer. "He's in the gig, a-minding the prad. Have you got a couches here that you could put it up in for 5 or 10 minutes? Brittles replying in the affirmative and pointing out the building, the portly man stepped back to the garden gate and helped his companion to put up the gig, while Brittles lighted them in a state of great admiration. This done, they returned to the house, and being shown into a parlour, took off their greatcoats and hats, and showed like what they were. The man who had knocked at the door was a stout personage of middle height, aged about 50, with shiny black hair cropped pretty close, half-whiskers, a round face, and sharp eyes. The other was a red-headed, bony man in top-boots, with a rather ill-favoured countenance and a turned-up, sinister-looking nose. "Tell your governor that Blathers and Duff is here, will you?" said the stouter man, smoothing down his hair, and laying a pair of handcuffs on the table. "No. Good evening, master. Can I have a word or two with you in private, if you please?" This was addressed to Mr. Lostburn, who now made his appearance. That gentleman, motioning Brittles to retire, brought in the two ladies and shut the door. "This is the lady of the house," said Mr. Lostburn, motioning towards Mrs. Maylie. Mr. Blathers made a bow. Being desired to sit down, he put his hat on the floor, and taking a chair, motioned to Duff to do the same. The latter gentleman, who did not appear quite so much accustomed to good society, or quite so much at his ease in it, one of the two, seated himself after undergoing several muscular affections of the limbs, and put the head of a stick into his mouth with some embarrassment. "Now, with regard to this here robbery, master," said Blathers, "what are the circumstances?" Mr. Lostburn, who appeared desirous of gaining time, recounted them at great length, and with much circumlocution. Messrs. Blathers and Duff looked very knowing meanwhile, and occasionally exchanged a nod. "I can't say for certain till I see the work, of course," said Blathers. "But my opinion at once is, I don't mind committing myself to that extent, that this wasn't done by a yokel. Eh, Duff?" "Certainly not," replied Duff. "And translating the word yokel for the benefit of the ladies, I apprehend your meaning to be that this attempt was not made by a countryman," said Mr. Lostburn with a smile. "That's it, master," replied Blathers. "This is all about the robbery, is it?" "All," replied the doctor. "Now, what is this about this here boy that the servants are a-talking on?" said Blathers. "Nothing at all," replied the doctor. "One of the frightened servants chose to take it into his head that he had something to do with this attempt to break into the house, but it's nonsense, sheer absurdity." "Very easy disposed of if it is," remarked Duff. "What he says is quite correct," observed Blathers, nodding his head in a confirmatory way, and playing carelessly with the handcuffs as if they were a pair of castanets. "Who is the boy? What account does he give of himself? Where did he come from? He didn't drop out of the clouds, did he, master?" "Of course not," replied the doctor, with a nervous glance at the two ladies. "I know his whole history, but we can talk about that presently. You would like first to see the place where the thieves made their attempt, I suppose?" "Certainly," rejoined Mr. Blathers. "We had better inspect the premises first, and examine the servants afterwards. That's the usual way of doing business." Lights were then procured, and Messrs. Blathers and Duff, attended by the native constable, Brittles, Giles, and everybody else in short, went into the little room at the end of the passage and looked out at the window, and afterwards went round by way of the lawn and looked in at the window, and after that had a candle handed out to inspect the shutters with, and after that a lantern to trace the footsteps with, and after that a pitchfork to poke the bushes with. This done, amidst the breathless interest of all beholders, they came in again, and Mr. Giles and Brittles were put through a melodramatic representation of their share in the previous night's adventures, which they performed some 6 times over, contradicting each other in not more than one important respect the first time, and in not more than a dozen the last. This consummation being arrived at, Blathers and Duff cleared the room, and held a long council together, compared with which, for secrecy and solemnity, a consultation of great doctors on the knottiest point in medicine would be mere child's play. Meanwhile, the doctor walked up and down the next room in a very uneasy state, and Mrs. Maylie and Rose looked on with anxious faces. "Upon my word," he said, making a halt after a great number of very rapid turns, "I hardly know what to do." "Surely," said Rose, "the poor child's story, faithfully repeated to these men, will be sufficient to exonerate him." "I doubt it, my dear young lady," said the doctor, shaking his head. "I don't think it would exonerate him, either with them or with the legal functionaries of a higher grade. What is he, after all, they would say? A runaway? Judged by mere worldly considerations and probabilities, his story is a very doubtful one." "You believe it, surely?" interrupted Rose. "I believe it, strange as it is, and perhaps I may be an old fool for doing so," rejoined the doctor. "But I don't think it is exactly the tale for a practical police officer, nevertheless." "Why not?" demanded Rose. "Because, my pretty cross-examiner," replied the doctor, "because viewed with their eyes there are many ugly points about it. He could only prove the parts that look ill, and none of those that look well. Confound the fellows, they will have the why and the wherefores, and will take nothing for granted. On his own showing, you see, he has been the companion of thieves for some time past. He has been carried to a police officer on a charge of picking a gentleman's pocket. He has been taken away forcibly from that gentleman's house to a place which he cannot describe or point out, and of the situation of which he has not the remotest idea. He is brought down to Chertsey by men who seem to have taken a violent fancy to him, whether he will or no, and he is put through a window to rob a house, and then, just at the very moment when he is going to alarm the inmates, and so do the very thing that would set him all to rights, there rushes into the way a blundering dog of a half-bred butler, and shoots him, as if on purpose to prevent his doing any good for himself. Don't you see all this?" "I see it, of course," replied Rose, smiling at the doctor's impetuosity. "But still, I do not see anything in it to criminate the poor child." "No," replied the doctor, "of course not. Bless the bright eyes of your sex, they never see, whether for good or bad, more than one side of any question, and that is always the one which first presents itself to them." Having given vent to this result of experience, the doctor put his hands into his pockets and walked up and down the room with even greater rapidity than before. "The more I think of it," said the doctor, "the more I see that it will occasion endless trouble and difficulty if we put these men in possession of the boy's real story. I am certain it will not be believed, and even if they can do nothing to him in the end, still the dragging it forward and giving publicity to all the doubts that will be cast upon it must interfere materially with your benevolent plan of rescuing him from misery." "Oh, what is to be done?" cried Rose. "Dear, dear, why did they send for those people?" "Why, indeed," exclaimed Mrs. Maylie, "I would not have had them here for the world." "All I know is," said Mr. Losberne at last, sitting down with a kind of desperate calmness, "that we must try and carry it off with a bold face. The object is a good one, and that must be our excuse. The boy has strong symptoms of fever upon him, and is in no condition to be talked to any more. That's one comfort. We must make the best of it, and if bad be the best, it's no fault of ours. Come in." "Well, master," said Blathers, entering the room, followed by his colleague, and making the door fast before he said any more. "This warn't a put-up thing." "And what the devil's a put-up thing?" demanded the doctor impatiently. "We call it a put-up robbery, ladies," said Blathers, turning to them, as if he pitied their ignorance, but had contempt for the doctor's, "when the servants is in it." "Nobody suspects them in this case," said Mrs. Maylie. "Very likely not, ma'am," replied Blathers, "but they might have been in it, for all that." "More likely on that very account," said Duff. "We find it was a town hand," said Blathers, continuing his report, "for the style of the work is first rate." "Very pretty indeed it is," remarked Duff in an undertone. "There was two of 'em in it," continued Blathers, "and they had a boy with 'em. That's plain from the size of the window. That's all to be said at present. We'll see this lad you've got upstairs at once, if you please." "Perhaps they will take something to drink first, Mrs. Maylie," said the doctor, his face brightening as if some new thought had occurred to him. "Oh, to be sure," exclaimed Rose eagerly. "You shall have it immediately, if you will." "Why, thank you, miss," said Blathers, drawing his coat sleeves across his mouth. "It's dry work, this sort of duty." "Anything that's handy, miss. Don't put yourself out of the way on our accounts." "What shall it be?" asked the doctor, following the young lady to the sideboard. "A little drop of spirits, master, if it's all the same," replied Blathers. "It's a cold ride from London, ma'am, and I always find that spirits comes home warmer to the feelings." This interesting communication was addressed to Mrs. Maylie, who received it very graciously. While it was being conveyed to her, the doctor slipped out of the room. "Ah," said Mr. Blathers, not holding his wine-glass by the stem, but grasping the bottom between the thumb and forefinger of his left hand, and placing it in front of his chest. "I have seen a good many pieces of business like this in my time, ladies." "That crack down in the back lane at Edmonton, Blathers," said Duff, assisting his colleague's memory. "That was something in this way, weren't it?" rejoined Blathers. "That was done by Conky Chickweed, that was." "You always gave that to him," replied Duff. "It was the family pet, I tell you. Conky hadn't any more to do with it than I had." "Get out," retorted Blathers. "I know better." "Do you mind that time when Corky was robbed of his money, though? What a start that was! Better than any novel book I ever see." "What was that?" inquired Rose, anxious to encourage any symptoms of good humour in the unwelcome visitors. "It was a robbery, miss, that hardly anybody would have been down upon," said Blathers. "This here Conky Chickweed—" "Conky means nosy, ma'am," interposed Duff. "Of course the lady knows that, don't she?" demanded Blathers. "Always interrupting, you are, partner. This here Conky Chickweed, miss, kept a public house over Battlebridge Way, and he had a cellar where a good many young lords went to see cockfighting and badger drawing and that, and a very intellectual manner the sports was conducted in, for I've seen 'em often. He weren't one of the family at that time, and one night he was robbed of 327 guineas in a canvas bag, that was stole out of his bedroom in the dead of night by a tall man with a black patch over his eye, who had concealed himself under the bed, and after committing the robbery jumped slap out of the window, which was only a story high. He was very quick about it, but Conky was quick too, for he fired a blunderbuss after him, and roused the neighbourhood. They set up a hue and cry directly, and when they came to look about 'em, found that Conky had hit the robber, for there was traces of blood all the way to some palings a good distance off, and there they lost him. However, he had made off with the blunt, and consequently the name of Mr. Chickweed, licensed whittler, appeared in the Gazette among the other bankrupts, and all manner of benefits and subscriptions, and I don't know what all, was got up for the poor man, who was in a very low state of mind about his loss, and went up and down the streets for 3 or 4 days, a pulling of his hair in such a desperate manner that many people was afraid he might be going to make away with himself. One day he came up to the office all in a hurry, and had a private interview with the magistrate, who, after a great deal of talk, rings the bell and orders Jim Spires in. Jim was an active officer, and tells him to go and assist Mr. Chickweed in apprehending the man as robbed his house. "I see him, Spires," said Chickweed, "past my house yesterday morning." "Why didn't you up and collar him?" says Spires. "I was so struck of a heap you might have fractured my skull with a toothpick," says the other man. "But we're sure to have him, for between 10 and 11 o'clock at night he passed again." Spires no sooner heard this than he put some clean linen and a comb in his pocket, in case he should have to stop a day or two, and away he goes and sets himself down at the public-house windows behind the little red curtain with his hat on, all ready to bolt out at a moment's notice. He was smoking his pipe here late at night, when all of a sudden Chickweed roars out, "Here he is! Stop! Thief! Murder!" Jim Spires dashes out, and there he sees Chickweed a-tearing down the street in full cry. Away goes Spires, on goes Chickweed, round turns the people, everybody roars out, "Thieves!" and Chickweed himself keeps on shouting all the time like mad. Spires loses sight of him a minute as he turns a corner, shoots round, sees a little crowd, dives in. "Which is the man?" "Damn me," said Chickweed, "I've lost him again." It was a remarkable occurrence, but he weren't to be seen nowhere, so they went back to the public house. Next morning Spires took his old place and looked out from behind the curtain for a tall man with a black patch over his eye, till his own 2 eyes ached again. At last he couldn't help shutting them, to ease him a minute, and the very moment he did so, he hears Chickweed a-roaring out, "Here he is!" Off he starts once more, with Chickweed halfway down the street ahead of him, and after twice as long a run as yesterday's one, the man's lost again. This was done once or twice more, till one half of the neighbours gave out that Mr. Chickweed had been robbed by the devil, who was playing tricks with him afterwards, and the other half that poor Mr. Chickweed had gone mad with grief. "What did Jim Spires say?" inquired the doctor, who had returned to the room shortly after the commencement of the story. "Well, Jim Spires," resumed the officer, "for a long time said nothing at all, and listened to everything without seeming to, which showed he understood his business. But one morning he walked into the bar, and, taking out a snuff-box, says, 'Chickweed, I've found out who has done this here robbery.' 'Have you?' said Chickweed. 'Oh, my dear Spires, only let me have vengeance, and I'll die contented. Oh, my dear Spires, where is the villain?' 'Come,' said Spires, offering him a pinch of snuff, 'none of that gammon. You did it yourself.' So he had, and a good bit of money he had made by it too, and nobody would never have found out if he hadn't been so precious anxious to keep up appearances,' said Mr. Blathers, putting down his wine-glass and clinking the handcuffs together. 'Very curious indeed,' observed the doctor. 'Now, if you please, you can walk upstairs.' 'If you please, sir,' returned Blathers. Closely following Mr. Losberne, the 2 officers ascended to Oliver's bedroom, Mr. Giles preceding the party with a lighted candle. Oliver had been dozing, but looked worse and was more feverish than he had appeared yet. Being assisted by the doctor, he managed to sit up in the bed for a minute or so, and looked at the strangers without at all understanding what was going forward, in fact, without seeming to recollect where he was, or what had been passing. "This," said Mr. Losberne, speaking softly, but with great vehemence notwithstanding, "this is the lad who, being accidentally wounded by a spring gun in some boyish trespass on Mr. What-do-you-call-him's ground, at the back here, comes to the house for assistance this morning, and is immediately laid hold of and maltreated by that ingenious gentleman with a candle in his hand, who has placed his life in considerable danger, as I can professionally certify." Messrs. Blathers and Duff looked at Mr. Giles, as he was thus recommended to their notice. The bewildered butler gazed from them towards Oliver, and from Oliver towards Mr. Losberne, with a most ludicrous mixture of fear and perplexity. "You don't mean to deny that, I suppose?" said the doctor, laying Oliver gently down again. "It was all done for the best, sir," answered Giles. "I am sure I thought it was the boy, or I wouldn't have meddled with him. I am not of an inhuman disposition, sir." "Thought it was what boy?" inquired the senior officer. "The housebreaker's boy, sir," replied Giles. They certainly had a boy." "Well, do you think so now?" inquired Blathers. "Think what now?" replied Giles, looking vacantly at his questioner. "Think it's the same boy, stupid head," rejoined Blathers impatiently. "I don't know. I really don't know," said Giles, with a rueful countenance. "I couldn't swear to him." "What do you think?" asked Mr. Blathers. "I don't know what to think," replied poor Giles. "I don't think he is the boy. Indeed, I am almost certain that it isn't. You know it can't be." "Has this man been a-drinking, sir?" inquired Blathers, turning to the doctor. "What a precious mud-leaded chap you are," said Duff, addressing Mr. Giles with supreme contempt. Mr. Losberne had been feeling the patient's pulse during this short dialogue, but he now rose from the chair by the bedside and remarked that if the officers had any doubts upon the subject, they would perhaps like to step into the next room and have Brittles before them. Acting upon the suggestion, they adjourned to a neighbouring apartment, where Mr. Brittles, being called in, involved himself and his respected superior in such a wonderful maze of fresh contradictions and impossibilities as tended to throw no particular light on anything but the fact of his own strong mystification, except indeed his declarations that he shouldn't know the real boy if he were put before him that instant, that he had only taken Oliver to be he because Mr. Giles had said it was he, and that Mr. Giles had 5 minutes previously admitted in the kitchen that he began to be very much afraid he had been a little too hasty. Among other ingenious surmises, the question then was raised whether Mr. Giles had really hit anybody, and upon examination of the fellow pistol to that which he had fired, it turned out to have no more destructive loading than gunpowder and brown paper, a discovery which made a considerable impression on everybody but the doctor, who had drawn the ball about 10 minutes before. Upon no one, however, did it make a greater impression than on Mr. Giles himself, who, after labouring for some hours under the fear of having mortally wounded a fellow creature, eagerly caught at this new idea, and favoured it to the utmost. Finally, the officers, without troubling themselves very much about Oliver, left the Chertsey constable in the house, and took up their rest for that night in the town, promising to return the next morning. With the next morning there came a rumour that 2 men and a boy were in the cage at Kingston, who had been apprehended overnight under suspicious circumstances, and to Kingston Messrs. Blathers and Duff journeyed accordingly. The suspicious circumstances, however, resolving themselves on investigation into one fact, that they had been discovered sleeping under a haystack, which, although a great crime, is only punishable by imprisonment, and is, in the merciful eye of the English law, and its comprehensive love of all the king's subjects, held to be no satisfactory proof in the absence of all other evidence that the sleeper or sleepers have committed burglary accompanied with violence, and have therefore rendered themselves liable to the punishment of death. Messrs. Blathers and Duff came back again, as wise as they went. In short, after some more examination and a great deal more conversation, a neighbouring magistrate was readily induced to take the joint bail of Mrs. Maylie and Mr. Losberne, for Oliver's appearance if he should ever be called upon, and Blathers and Duff, being rewarded with a couple of guineas, returned to town with divided opinions on the subject of their expedition, the latter gentleman, on mature consideration of all the circumstances, inclining to the belief that the burglarious attempts had originated with the family pet, and the former being equally disposed to concede the full merit of it to the great Mr. Conkey Chickweed. Meanwhile, Oliver gradually throve and prospered under the united care of Mrs. Maylie, Rose, and the kind-hearted Mr. Losberne. If fervent prayers gushing from hearts overcharged with gratitude be heard in heaven, and if they be not, what prayers are, the blessings which the orphan child called down upon them sunk into their souls, diffusing peace and happiness. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Of the happy life Oliver began to lead with his kind friends. Oliver's ailings were neither slight nor few. In addition to the pain and delay attendant on a broken limb, his exposure to the wet and cold had brought on fever and ague, which hung about him for many weeks, and reduced him sadly. But at length he began by slow degrees to get better, and to be able to say sometimes in a few tearful words how deeply he felt the goodness of the 2 sweet ladies, and how ardently he hoped that when he grew strong and well again he could do something to show his gratitude, only something which would let them see the love and duty with which his breast was full, something, however slight, which would prove to them that their gentle kindness had not been cast away, but that the poor boy whom their charity had rescued from misery or death was eager to serve them with his whole heart and soul. "Poor fellow," said Rose, when Oliver had been one day feebly endeavouring to utter the words of thankfulness that rose to his pale lips, "you shall have many opportunities of serving us, if you will. We are going to the country, and my aunt intends that you shall accompany us. The quiet place, the pure air, and all the pleasure and beauties of spring will restore you in a few days. We will employ you in 100 ways when you can bear the trouble." "The trouble!" cried Oliver. "Oh, dear lady, if I could but work for you, if I could only give you pleasure by watering your flowers, or watching your birds, or running up and down the whole day long to make you happy, what would I give to do it?" "Well, you shall give nothing at all," said Mrs. Maylie, smiling. "For, as I told you before, we shall employ you in 100 ways, and if you only take half the trouble to please us that you promise now, you will make me very happy indeed." "Happy, ma'am?" cried Oliver. "Oh, how kind of you to say so!" "You will make me happier than I can tell you," replied the young lady. "To think that my dear good aunt should have been the means of rescuing any one from such misery as you have described to us would be an unspeakable pleasure to me. But to know that the object of her goodness and compassion was sincerely grateful and attached in consequence would delight me more than you can well imagine. Do you understand me?" she inquired, watching Oliver's thoughtful face. "Oh, yes, ma'am, yes," replied Oliver eagerly. "But I was thinking that I am ungrateful now." "To whom?" inquired the young lady. "To the kind gentleman and the dear old nurse who took so much care of me before," rejoined Oliver. "If they knew how happy I am, they would be pleased, I am sure." "I am sure they would," rejoined Oliver's benefactress. "And Mr. Losburn has already been kind enough to promise that when you are well enough to bear the journey, he will carry you to see them." "Has he, ma'am?" cried Oliver, his face brightening with pleasure. "I don't know what I shall do for joy when I see their faces once again." In a short time Oliver was sufficiently recovered to undergo the fatigue of this expedition. One morning he and Mr. Losburn set out accordingly, in a little carriage which belonged to Mrs. Maylie. When they came to Chertsey Bridge, Oliver turned very pale, and uttered a loud exclamation. "What's the matter with the boy?" cried the doctor, as usual, all in a bustle. "Do you see anything, hear anything, feel anything, eh?" "That, sir," cried Oliver, pointing out of the carriage window. "That house." "Yes, well, what of it?" "Stop, coachman, pull up here," cried the doctor. "What of the house, my man, eh?" "The thieves. The house they took me to," whispered Oliver. "The devil it is!" cried the doctor. "Hello there, let me out." But before the coachman could dismount from his box, he had tumbled out of the coach by some means or other, and running down to the deserted tenement began kicking at the door like a madman. "Hello," said a little ugly humpbacked man, opening the door so suddenly that the doctor, from the very impetus of his last kick, nearly fell forward into the passage. "What's the matter here?" "Matter?" exclaimed the other, collaring him without a moment's reflection. "A good deal. Robbery is the matter." "There'll be murder the matter too," replied the humpbacked man coolly, "if you don't take your hands off. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," said the doctor, giving his captive a hearty shake. "Where's, confound the fellow, what's his rascally name? Sikes, that's it. Where's Sikes, you thief?" The humpbacked man stared, as if in excess of amazement and indignation, and twisting himself dexterously from the doctor's grasp, growled forth a volley of horrid oaths, and retired to the house. Before he could shut the door, however, the doctor had passed into the parlour without a word of parley. He looked anxiously round. Not an article of furniture, not a vestige of anything, animate or inanimate, not even the position of the cupboards, answered to Oliver's description. "Now," said the humpbacked man, who had watched him keenly, "what do you mean by coming into my house in this violent way? Do you want to rob me or to murder me? Which is it? Did you ever know a man come out to do either in a chariot and pair, you ridiculous old vampire?" said the irritable doctor. "What do you want, then?" demanded the hunchback. "Will you take yourself off before I do you a mischief, curse you?" "As soon as I think proper," said Mr. Losburn, looking into the other parlour, which, like the first, bore no resemblance whatever to Oliver's account of it. "I shall find you out some day, my friend." "Will you?" sneered the ill-favoured cripple. "If you ever want me, I'm here. I haven't lived here mad and all alone for 25 years to be scared by you. You shall pay for this, you shall pay for this." And so saying, the misshapen little demon set up a yell, and danced upon the ground as if wild with rage. "It's stupid enough, this," muttered the doctor to himself. "The boy must have made a mistake. Here, put that in your pocket and shut yourself up again." With these words he flung the hunchback a piece of money, and returned to the carriage. The man followed to the chariot door, uttering the wildest imprecations and curses all the way. But as Mr. Losburn turned to speak to the driver, he looked into the carriage, and eyed Oliver for an instant with a glance so sharp and fierce, and at the same time so furious and vindictive, that waking or sleeping he could not forget it for months afterwards. He continued to utter the most fearful imprecations until the driver had resumed his seat, and when they were once more on their way they could see him some distance behind, beating his feet upon the ground and tearing his hair, in transports of real or pretended rage. "I am an ass," said the doctor after a long silence. "Did you know that before, Oliver?" "No, sir." "Then don't forget it another time." "An ass," said the doctor again, after a further silence of some minutes. "Even if it had been the right place, and the right fellows had been there, what could I have done single-handed? And if I had had assistance, I see no good that I should have done, except leading to my own exposure, and an unavoidable statement of the manner in which I have hushed up this business. That would have served me right, though. I am always involving myself in some scrape or other by acting on impulse. It might have done me good." Now the fact was that the excellent doctor had never acted upon anything but impulse all through his life, and it was no bad compliment to the nature of the impulses which governed him that, so far from being involved in any peculiar troubles or misfortunes, he had the warmest respect and esteem of all who knew him. If the truth must be told, he was a little out of temper for a minute or two at being disappointed in procuring corroborative evidence of Oliver's story on the very first occasion on which he had a chance of obtaining any. He soon came round again, however, and finding that Oliver's replies to his questions were still as straightforward and consistent, and still delivered with as much apparent sincerity and truth as they had ever been, he made up his mind to attach full credence to them from that time forth. As Oliver knew the name of the street in which Mr. Brownlow resided, they were enabled to drive straight thither. When the coach turned into it, his heart beat so violently that he could scarcely draw his breath. "Now, my boy, which house is it?" inquired Mr. Losberne. That," replied Oliver, pointing eagerly out of the window. "The White House. Oh, make haste, pray make haste. I feel as if I should die. It makes me tremble so." "Come, come," said the good doctor, patting him on the shoulder. "You will see them directly, and they will be overjoyed to find you safe and well." "Oh, I hope so," cried Oliver. "They were so good to me, so very good to me." The coach rolled on. It stopped. No, that was the wrong house, the next door. It went on a few paces and stopped again. Oliver looked up at the windows, with tears of happy expectation coursing down his face. Alas, the White House was empty, and there was a bill in the window, "To let." "Knock at the next door," cried Mr. Losberne, taking Oliver's arm in his. "What has become of Mr. Brownlow, who used to live in the adjoining house? Do you know?" The servant did not know, but would go to inquire. She presently returned and said that Mr. Brownlow had sold off his goods and gone to the West Indies 6 weeks before. Oliver clasped his hands and sank feebly backwards. "Has his housekeeper gone too?" inquired Mr. Losberne after a moment's pause. "Yes, sir," replied the servant. "The old gentleman, the housekeeper, and a gentleman who is a friend of Mr. Brownlow's all went together." "Then turn us home again," said Mr. Losberne to the driver, "and don't stop to bait the horses till you get out of this confounded London." "The bookstall keeper, sir," said Oliver. "I know the way there. See him, sir, pray. Do see him." "My poor boy, this is disappointment enough for one day," said the doctor. "Quite enough for both of us. If we go to the bookstall keeper's, we shall certainly find that he is dead, or he has set his house on fire or run away. No, home again straight." And in obedience to the doctor's impulse, home they went. This bitter disappointment caused Oliver so much sorrow and grief, even in the midst of his happiness, for he had pleased himself many times during his illness with thinking of all that Mr. Brownlow and Mrs. Bedwin would say to him, and what delight it would be to tell them how many long days and nights he had passed in reflecting on what they had done for him, and in bewailing his cruel separation from them. The hope of eventually clearing himself with them too, and explaining how he had been forced away, had buoyed him up and sustained him under many of his recent trials. And now the idea that they should have gone so far, and carried with him the belief that he was an impostor and a robber, a belief which might remain uncontradicted to his dying day, was almost more than he could bear. The circumstance occasioned no alteration, however, in the behaviour of his benefactors. After another fortnight, when the fine warm weather had fairly begun, and every tree and flower was putting forth its young leaves and rich blossoms, they made preparations for quitting the house at Chertsey for some months. Sending the plate, which had so excited Fagin's cupidity, to the bankers, and leaving Giles and another servant in care of the house, they departed to a cottage at some distance in the country, and took Oliver with them. Who can describe the pleasure and delight, the peace of mind and soft tranquillity the sickly boy felt in the balmy air, and among the green hills and rich woods of an inland village? Who can tell how scenes of peace and quietude sink into the minds of pain-worn dwellers in close and noisy places, and carry their own freshness deep into their jaded hearts? Men who have lived in crowded, pent-up streets through lives of toil, and who have never wished for change. Men to whom custom has indeed been second nature, and who would have come almost to love each brick and stone that formed the narrow boundaries of their daily walks, even they, with a hand of death upon them, have been known to yearn at last for one short glimpse of nature's face, and, carried far from the scenes of their old pains and pleasures, have seemed to pass at once into a new state of being. Crawling forth from day to some green, sunny spot, they have had such memories wakened up in them by the sight of the sky and hill and plain and glistening water, that a foretaste of heaven itself had soothed their quick decline, and they have sunk into their tombs as peacefully as the sun whose setting they watched from their lonely chamber window but a few hours before, faded from their dim and feeble sight. The memories which peaceful country scenes call up are not of this world, nor of its thoughts and hopes. Their gentle influence may teach us how to weave fresh garlands for the graves of those we loved, may purify our thoughts, and bear down before it old enmity and hatred. But beneath all this there lingers in the least reflective mind a vague and half-formed consciousness of having held such feelings long before, in some remote and distant time, which calls up solemn thoughts of distant times to come, and bends down pride and worldliness beneath it. It was a lovely spot to which they repaired. Oliver, whose days had been spent among squalid crowds and in the midst of noise and brawling, seemed to enter on a new existence there. The rose and honeysuckle clung to the cottage walls, the ivy crept round the trunks of the trees, and the garden flowers perfumed the air with delicious odours. Hard by was a little churchyard, not crowded with tall and sightly gravestones, but full of humble mounds, covered with fresh turf and moss, beneath which the old people of the village lay at rest. Oliver had wandered here, and thinking of the wretched grave in which his mother lay, would sometimes sit him down and sob unseen. But when he raised his eyes to the deep sky overhead, he would cease to think of her as lying in the ground, and would weep for her, sadly, but without pain. It was a happy time. The days were peaceful and serene. The nights brought with them neither fear nor care. No languishing in a wretched prison, or associating with wretched men. Nothing but pleasant and happy thoughts. Every morning he went to a white-haired old gentleman, who lived near the little church, who taught him to read better and to write, and who spoke so kindly and took such pains that Oliver could never try enough to please him. Then he would walk with Mrs. Maylie and Rose, and hear them talk of books, or perhaps sit near them in some shady place, and listen while the young lady read, which he could have done until it grew too dark to see the letters. Then he had his own lesson for the next day to prepare, and at this he would work hard in a little room which looked into the garden, till evening came slowly on, when the ladies would walk out again, and he with them, listening with much pleasure to all they said, and so happy if they wanted a flower that he could climb to reach, or had forgotten anything he could run to fetch, that he could never be quick enough about it. When it became quite dark and they returned home, the young lady would sit down to the piano and play some pleasant air, or sing in a low and gentle voice some old song which it pleased her aunt to hear. There would be no candles lighted at such times as these, and Oliver would sit by one of the windows listening to the sweet music in a perfect rapture. And when Sunday came, how different the day was spent from any way in which he had ever spent it yet, and how happily too, like all the other days in that most happy time. There was the little church in the morning, with the green leaves fluttering at the windows, the birds singing without, and the sweet-smelling air stealing in at the low porch and filling the homely building with its fragrance. The poor people were so neat and clean, and knelt so reverently in prayer, that it seemed a pleasure, not a tedious duty, their assembling there together. And though the singing might be rude, it was real, and sounded more musical, to Oliver's ears at least, than any he had ever heard in church before. Then there were the walks as usual, and many calls at the clean houses of the labouring men, and at night Oliver read a chapter or two from the Bible, which he had been studying all the week, and in the performance of which duty he felt more proud and pleased than if he had been the clergyman himself. In the morning Oliver would be afoot by 6 o'clock, roaming the fields and plundering the hedges far and wide for nosegays of wild flowers, with which he would return laden home, and which it took great care and consideration to arrange to the best advantage for the embellishment of the breakfast table. There was fresh groundsel, too, for Miss Maylie's birds, with which Oliver, who had been studying the subject under the able tuition of the village clerk, would decorate the cages in the most approved taste. When the birds were all made spruce and smart for the day, there was usually some little commission of charity to execute in the village, or, failing that, there was rare cricket playing sometimes on the green, or, failing that, there was always something to do in the garden, or about the plants, to which Oliver, who had studied this science also under the same master who was a gardener by trade, applied himself with hearty good will, until Miss Rose made her appearance, when there were 1,000 commendations to be bestowed on all he had done. So 3 months glided away, 3 months which, in the life of the most blessed and favoured of mortals, might have been unmingled happiness, and which in Oliver's were true felicity. With the purest and most amiable generosity on one side, and the truest, warmest, soul-felt gratitude on the other, it is no wonder that by the end of that short time Oliver Twist had become completely domesticated with the old lady and her niece, and that the fervent attachment of his young and sensitive heart was repaid by their pride in and attachment to himself. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, wherein the happiness of Oliver and his friends experiences a sudden check. Spring flew swiftly by, and summer came. If the village had been beautiful at first, it was now in the full glow and luxuriance of its richness. The great trees, which had looked shrunken and bare in the earlier months, had now burst into strong life and health, and stretching forth their green arms over the thirsty ground, converted open and naked spots into choice nooks, where was a deep and pleasant shade from which to look upon the wide prospect, steeped in sunshine, which lay stretched beyond. The earth had donned her mantle of brightest green, and shed her richest perfumes abroad. It was the prime and vigour of the year. All things were glad and flourishing. Still the same quiet life went on at the little cottage, and the same cheerful serenity prevailed among its inmates. Oliver had long since grown stout and healthy, but health or sickness made no difference in his warm feelings to those about him, though they do in the feelings of a great many people. He was still the same gentle, attached, affectionate creature that he had been when pain and suffering had wasted his strength, and when he was dependent for every slight attention and comfort on those who tended him. One beautiful night, when they had taken a longer walk than was customary with them, for the day had been unusually warm, and there was a brilliant moon, and a light wind had sprung up which was unusually refreshing. Rose had been in high spirits too, and they had walked on in merry conversation until they had far exceeded their ordinary bounds. Mrs. Maylie being fatigued, they returned more slowly home. The young lady, merely throwing off her simple bonnet, sat down to the piano as usual. After running abstractedly over the keys for a few minutes, she fell into a low and very solemn air, and as she played it, they heard a sound as if she were weeping. "Rose, my dear," said the elder lady. Rose made no reply, but played a little quicker, as if the words had roused her from some painful thoughts. "Rose, my love," cried Mrs. Maylie, rising hastily, and bending over her. "What is this? In tears, my dear child? What distresses you?" "Nothing, aunt, nothing," replied the young lady. "I don't know what it is. I can't describe it, but I feel—" "Not ill, my love?" interposed Mrs. Maylie. "No, oh, not ill," replied Rose, shuddering as though some deadly chillness were passing over her while she spoke. "I shall be better presently. Close the window, pray." Oliver hastened to comply with her request. The young lady, making an effort to recover her cheerfulness, strove to play some livelier tune, but her fingers dropped powerlessly over the keys.
Covering her face with her hand, she sank upon a sofa and gave vent to the tears which she was now unable to repress. "My child," said the elderly lady, folding her arms about her, "I never saw you so before." "I would not alarm you if I could avoid it," rejoined Rose, "but indeed I have tried very hard, and cannot help this. I fear I am ill, aunt." She was indeed, for when candles were brought, they saw that in the very short time which had elapsed since their return home, the hue of her countenance had changed to a marble whiteness. Its expression had lost nothing of its beauty, but it was changed, and there was an anxious, haggard look about the gentle face which it had never worn before. Another minute, and it was suffused with a crimson flush, and a heavy wildness came over the soft blue eye. Again this disappeared, like the shadow thrown by a passing cloud, and she was once more deadly pale. Oliver, who watched the old lady anxiously, observed that she was alarmed by these appearances, and so in truth was he, but seeing that she affected to make light of them, he endeavoured to do the same, and they so far succeeded that when Rose was persuaded by her aunt to retire for the night, she was in better spirits, and appeared even in better health, assuring them that she felt certain she would rise in the morning quite well. "I hope," said Oliver when Mrs. Maylie returned, "that nothing is the matter. She don't look so well to-night, but—" The old lady motioned him not to speak, and sitting herself down in a dark corner of the room, remained silent for some time. At length she said in a trembling voice, "I hope not, Oliver. I have been very happy with her for some years, too happy perhaps. It may be time that I should meet with some misfortune, but I hope it is not this." "What?" inquired Oliver. "The heavy blow," said the old lady, "of losing the dear girl who has been so long my comfort and happiness." "Oh, God forbid!" exclaimed Oliver hastily. "Amen to that, my child," said the old lady, wringing her hands. "Surely there is no danger of anything so dreadful," said Oliver. 2 hours ago she was quite well." "She is very ill now," rejoined Mrs. Maylie, "and will be worse, I am sure. My dear, dear Rose! Oh, what shall I do without her?" She gave way to such great grief that Oliver, suppressing his own emotion, ventured to remonstrate with her, and to beg earnestly that for the sake of the dear young lady herself she would be more calm. "And consider, ma'am," said Oliver, as the tears forced themselves into his eyes, despite of his efforts to the contrary, "oh, consider how young and good she is, and what pleasure and comfort she gives to all about her. I am sure, certain, quite certain, that for your sake, who are so good yourself, and for her own, and for the sake of all she makes so happy, she will not die. Heaven will never let her die so young." "Hush," said Mrs. Maylie, laying her hand on Oliver's head. "You think like a child, poor boy, but you teach me my duty notwithstanding. I had quite forgotten it for a moment, Oliver, but I hope I may be pardoned, for I am old, and have seen enough of illness and death to know the agony of separation from the objects of our love. I have seen enough too to know that it is not always the youngest and best who are spared to those that love them. But this should give us comfort in our sorrow, for heaven is just, and such things teach us impressively that there is a brighter world than this, and that the passage to it is speedy. God's will be done. I love her, and he knows how well." Oliver was surprised to see that as Mrs. Maylie said these words, she checked her lamentations as though by one effort, and drawing herself up as she spoke, became composed and firm. He was still more astonished to find that this firmness lasted, and that, under all the care and watching which ensued, Mrs. Maylie was ever ready and collected, performing all the duties which had devolved upon her steadily, and to all external appearances even cheerfully. But he was young, and did not know what strong minds are capable of under trying circumstances. How should he, when their possessors so seldom know themselves? An anxious night ensued. When morning came, Mrs. Maylie's predictions were but too well verified. Rose was in the first stage of a high and dangerous fever. "We must be active, Oliver, and not give way to useless grief," said Mrs. Maylie, laying her finger on her lip, as she looked steadily into his face. "This letter must be sent with all possible expedition to Mr. Losberne. It must be carried to the market town, which is not more than 4 miles off, by the footpath across the field, and thence dispatched by an express on horseback straight to Chertsey. The people at the inn will undertake to do this, and I can trust you to see it done, I know." Oliver could make no reply, but looked his anxiety to be gone at once. "Here is another letter," said Mrs. Maylie, pausing to reflect. "But whether to send it now, or wait until I see how Rose goes on, I scarcely know. I would not forward it unless I fear the worst." "Is it for Chertsey too, ma'am?" inquired Oliver, impatient to execute his commission, and holding out his trembling hand for the letter. "No," replied the old lady, giving it to him mechanically. Oliver glanced at it, and saw that it was directed to Harry Maylie, Esquire, at some great lord's house in the country, where he could not make out. "Shall it go, ma'am?" asked Oliver, looking up impatiently. "I think not," replied Mrs. Maylie, taking it back. "I will wait until tomorrow." With these words she gave Oliver her purse, and he started off without more delay at the greatest speed he could muster. Swiftly he ran across the fields and down the little lanes which sometimes divided them, now almost hidden by the high corn on either side, and now emerging on an open field where the mowers and haymakers were busily at their work. Nor did he stop once, save now and then for a few seconds to recover breath, until he came, in a great heat and covered with dust, on the little market-place of the market town. He paused and looked about for the inn. There were a white bank and a red brewery and a yellow town hall, and in one corner was a large house with all the wood about it painted green, before which was the sign of the George. To this he hastened as soon as it caught his eye. He spoke to a post-boy who was dozing under a gateway, and who, after hearing what he wanted, referred him to the ostler, who, after hearing all he had to say again, referred him to the landlord, who was a tall gentleman in a blue neckcloth, a white hat, drab breeches, and boots with tops to match. He leaned against a pump by the stable door, picking his teeth with a silver toothpick. This gentleman walked with much deliberation into the bar to make out the bill, which took a long time in making out, and after it was ready and paid, a horse had to be saddled and a man to be dressed, which took up 10 good minutes more. Meanwhile Oliver was in such a desperate state of impatience and anxiety that he felt as if he could have jumped upon the horse himself and galloped away full tear to the next stage. At length all was ready, and the little parcel having been handed up, with many injunctions and entreaties for its speedy delivery, the man set spurs to his horse, and rattling over the uneven paving of the market-place, was out of the town and galloping along the turnpike road in a couple of minutes. As it was something to feel certain that assistance was sent for, and that no time had been lost, Oliver hurried up the inn-yard, with a somewhat lighter heart. He was turning out of the gateway when he accidentally stumbled against a tall man wrapped in a cloak, who was at that moment coming out of the inn-door. "Ha!" cried the man, fixing his eyes on Oliver, and suddenly recoiling. "What the devil is this?" "I beg your pardon, sir," said Oliver. "I was in a great hurry to get home, and didn't see you were coming." "Death!" muttered the man to himself, glaring at the boy with his large dark eyes. "Who could have thought it? Grind him to ashes, he'd start up from the stone coffin to come in my way." "I am sorry," stammered Oliver, confused by the strange man's wild look. "I hope I have not hurt you." "Rot you," murmured the man, in a horrible passion between his clenched teeth. "If I had only the courage to say the word, I might have been free from you in a night. Curses on your head, and black death on your heart, you imp! What are you doing here?" The man shook his fist as he uttered these words incoherently. He advanced towards Oliver, as if with the intention of aiming a blow at him, but fell violently on the ground, writhing and foaming in a fit. Oliver gazed for a moment at the struggles of the madman, for such he supposed him to be, and then darted off into the house for help. Having seen him safely carried into the hotel, he turned his face homewards, running as fast as he could to make up for lost time, and recalling with a great deal of astonishment and some fear the extraordinary behaviour of the person from whom he had just parted. The circumstance did not dwell on his recollection long, however, for when he reached the cottage there was enough to occupy his mind, and to drive all considerations of self completely from his memory. Rose Maylie had rapidly grown worse. Before midnight she was delirious. A medical practitioner who resided on the spot was in constant attendance upon her, and after first seeing the patient, he had taken Mrs. Maylie aside and pronounced her disorder to be one of a most alarming nature. "In fact," he said, "it would be little short of a miracle if she recovered." How often did Oliver start from his bed that night, and stealing out with noiseless footstep to the staircase, listen for the slightest sound from the sick chamber. How often did a tremble shake his frame, and cold drops of terror start upon his brow, when a sudden trampling of feet caused him to fear that something too dreadful to think of had even then occurred. And what had been the fervency of all the prayers he had ever muttered, compared with those he poured forth now, in the agony and passion of his supplication for the life and health of the gentle creature who was tottering on the deep grave's verge? Oh, the suspense, the fearful, acute suspense of standing idly by, while the life of one we dearly love is trembling in the balance. Oh, the racking thoughts that crowd upon the mind, and make the heart beat violently and the breath come thick, by the force of the images they conjure up before it. The desperate anxiety to be doing something, to relieve the pain or lessen the danger which we have no power to alleviate. The sinking of soul and spirit which the sad remembrance of our helplessness produces. What tortures can equal these? What reflections or endeavours can, in the full tide and fever of the time, allay them? Morning came, and the little cottage was lonely and still. People spoke in whispers. Anxious faces appeared at the gate from time to time. Women and children went away in tears. All the livelong day, and for hours after it had grown dark, Oliver paced softly up and down the garden, raising his eyes every instant to the sick chamber, and shuddering to see the darkened window, looking as if death lay stretched inside. Late that night Mr. Losberne arrived. "It is hard," said the good doctor, turning away as he spoke. "So young, so much beloved, but there is very little hope." Another morning. The sun shone brightly as if it looked upon no misery or care, and with every leaf and flower in full bloom about her. With life and health and sounds and sights of joy surrounding her on every side, the fair young creature lay wasting fast. Oliver crept away to the old churchyard, and sitting down on one of the green mounds, wept and prayed for her in silence. There was such peace and beauty in the scene, so much of brightness and mirth in the sunny landscape, such blithesome music in the songs of the summer birds, such freedom in the rapid flight of the rook careering overhead, so much of life and joyousness in all, that when the boy raised his aching eyes and looked about, the thought instinctively occurred to him that this was not the time for death, that Rose could surely never die when humbler things were all so glad and gay, that graves were for cold and cheerless winter, not for sunlight and fragrance. He almost thought that shrouds were for the old and shrunken, and that they never wrapped the young and graceful form in their ghastly folds. A knell from the church bell broke harshly on these youthful thoughts. Another, again. It was tolling for the funeral service. A group of humble mourners entered the gate, wearing white favours, for the corpse was young. They stood uncovered by a grave, and there was a mother once, among the weeping train. But the sun shone brightly, and the birds sang on. Oliver turned homeward, thinking on the many kindnesses he had received from the young lady, and wishing that the time might come again that he might never cease showing her how grateful and attached he was. He had no cause for self-reproach on the score of neglect or want of thought, for he had been devoted to her service, and yet 100 little occasions rose up before him, on which he fancied he might have been more zealous and more earnest, and wished he had been. We need be careful how we deal with those about us, when every death carries to some small circle of survivors thoughts of so much omitted, and so little done, of so many things forgotten, and so many more which might have been repaired. There is no remorse so deep as that which is unavailing. If we could be spared its tortures, let us remember this in time. When he reached home, Mrs. Maylie was sitting in the little parlour. Oliver's heart sank at the sight of her, for she had never left the bedside of her niece, and he trembled to think what change could have driven her away. He learnt that she had fallen into a deep sleep from which she would waken either to recovery and life, or to bid them farewell and die. They sat listening and afraid to speak for hours. The untasted meal was removed, with looks which showed that their thoughts were elsewhere. They watched the sun as he sank lower and lower, and at length cast over sky and earth those brilliant hues which herald its departure. Their quick ears caught the sound of an approaching footstep. They both involuntarily darted to the door as Mr. Losberne entered. "What of Rose?" cried the old lady. "Tell me at once. I can bear it. Anything but suspense. Oh, tell me, in the name of heaven." "You must compose yourself," said the doctor, supporting her. "Be calm, my dear ma'am, pray." "Let me go, in God's name. My dear child, She is dead! She is dying!" "No," cried the doctor passionately. "As he is good and merciful, she will live to bless us all for years to come." The lady fell upon her knees and tried to fold her hands together, but the energy which had supported her so long fled up to heaven with her first thanksgiving, and she sank into the friendly arms which were extended to receive her. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens contains some introductory particulars relative to a young gentleman who now arrives upon the scene, and a new adventure which happened to Oliver. It was almost too much happiness to bear. Oliver felt stunned and stupefied by the unexpected intelligence. He could not weep or speak or rest. He had scarcely the power of understanding anything that had passed, until, after a long ramble in the quiet evening air, a burst of tears came to his relief, and he seemed to awaken all at once to a full sense of the joyful change that had occurred, and the almost insupportable load of anguish which had been taken from his breast. The night was fast closing in when he returned homeward, laden with flowers which he had culled with peculiar care for the adornment of the sick chamber. As he walked briskly along the road, he heard behind him the noise of some vehicle approaching at a furious pace. Looking round, he saw that it was a post-chaise, driven at great speed, and as the horses were galloping and the road was narrow, he stood leaning against a gate until it should have passed him. As it dashed on, Oliver caught a glimpse of a man in a white nightcap, whose face seemed familiar to him, although his view was so brief that he could not identify the person. In another second or two the nightcap was thrust out of the chaise window, and a stentorian voice bellowed to the driver to stop, which he did as soon as he could pull up his horses. Then the nightcap once again appeared, and the same voice called Oliver by his name. "Here!" cried the voice. "Oliver! What's the news? Miss Rose! Master Oliver!" "Is it you, Giles?" cried Oliver, running up to the chaise door. Giles popped out his nightcap again, preparatory to making some reply, when he was suddenly pulled back by a gentleman who occupied the other corner of the chaise, and who eagerly demanded what was the news. "In a word," cried the gentleman, "better or worse?" "Better, much better," replied Oliver hastily. "Thank heaven!" exclaimed the gentleman. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure," replied Oliver. "The change took place only a few hours ago, and Mr. Losberne says that all danger is at an end." The gentleman said not another word, but opening the chaise door, leaped out, and taking Oliver hurriedly by the arm, led him aside. "You are quite certain? There is no possibility of any mistake on your part, my boy, is there?" demanded the gentleman in a tremulous voice. "Do not deceive me by awakening hopes that are not to be fulfilled." "I would not for the world, sir," replied Oliver. "Indeed, you may believe me. Mr. Losberne's words were that she would live to bless us all for many years to come. I heard him say so." The tears stood in Oliver's eyes as he recalled the scene which was the beginning of so much happiness, and the gentleman turned his face away and remained silent for some minutes. Oliver thought he heard him sob more than once, but he feared to interrupt him by any fresh remark, for he could well guess what his feelings were, and so stood apart, feigning to be occupied with his nosegay. All this time Mr. Giles, with a white nightcap on, had been sitting on the steps of the chaise, supporting an elbow on each knee and wiping his eyes with a blue cotton pocket-handkerchief dotted with white spots. That the honest fellow had not been feigning emotion was abundantly demonstrated by the very red eyes with which he regarded the young gentleman when he turned round and addressed him. "I think you had better go on to my mother's in the chaise, Giles," said he. "I would rather walk slowly on so as to gain some little time before I see her. You can say I am coming." "I beg your pardon, Mr. Harry," said Giles, giving a final polish to his ruffled countenance with a handkerchief. "But if you would leave the post-boy to say that, I should be very much obliged to you. It wouldn't be proper for the maids to see me in this state, sir. I should never have any more authority with them if they did." "Well," rejoined Harry Maylie, smiling, "you can do as you like. Let him go on with the luggage if you wish it, and do you follow with us. Only first exchange that nightcap for some more appropriate covering, or we shall be taken for madmen." Mr. Giles, reminded of his unbecoming costume, snatched off and pocketed his nightcap, and substituted a hat of grave and sober shape, which he took out of the chaise. This done, the post-boy drove off. Giles, Mr. Maylie, and Oliver followed at their leisure. As they walked along, Oliver glanced from time to time with much interest and curiosity at the newcomer. He seemed about 25 years of age, and was of the middle height. His countenance was frank and handsome, and his demeanour easy and prepossessing. Notwithstanding the difference between youth and age, he bore so strong a likeness to the old lady that Oliver would have had no great difficulty in imagining their relationship, if he had not already spoken of her as his mother. Mrs. Maylie was anxiously waiting to receive her son when he reached the cottage. The meeting did not take place without great emotion on both sides. "Mother," whispered the young man, "why did you not write before?" "I did," replied Mrs. Maylie, "but on reflection I determined to keep back the letter until I had heard Mr. Losburne's opinion." "But why?" said the young man. "Why run the chance of that occurring which so nearly happened? If Rose had—I cannot utter that word now—if this illness had terminated differently, how could you ever have forgiven yourself? How could I ever have known happiness again?" "If that had been the case, Harry," said Mrs. Maylie, "I fear your happiness would have been effectually blighted, and that your arrival here a day sooner or a day later would have been of very, very little import." "And who can wonder if it be so, mother?" rejoined the young man. "Or why should I say if? It is, you know it, mother, you must know it." "I know that she deserves the best and purest love the heart of a man can offer," said Mrs. Maylie. "I know that the devotion and affection of her nature require no ordinary return, but one that shall be deep and lasting. If I did not feel this, and know besides that a changed behaviour in one she loved would break her heart, I should not feel my task so difficult of performance, or have to encounter so many struggles in my own bosom, when I take what seems to be the strict line of duty." "This is unkind, mother," said Harry. "Do you suppose that I am a boy ignorant of my own mind, and mistaking the impulses of my own soul?" "I think, my dear son," returned Mrs. Maylie, laying her hand upon his shoulder, "that youth has many generous impulses which do not last, and that among them are some which, being gratified, become only the more fleeting. Above all, I think," said the lady, fixing her eyes on her son's face, "that if an enthusiastic, ardent, and ambitious man marry a wife on whose name there is a stain, which, though it originate in no fault of hers, may be visited by cold and sordid people upon her and upon his children also, and in exact proportion to his success in the world, be cast in his teeth and made the subject of sneers against him, he may, no matter how generous and good his nature, one day repent of the connection he formed in early life, and she may have the pain of knowing that he does so." "Mother," said the young man impatiently, "he would be a selfish brute, unworthy alike of the name of man and of the woman you describe, who acted thus." "You think so now, Harry?" replied his mother. "And ever will," said the young man. "The mental agony I have suffered during the last 2 days wrings from me the avowal to you of a passion which, as you well know, is not one of yesterday, nor one I have lightly formed. On Rose, sweet gentle girl, my heart is set, as firmly as ever heart of man was set on woman. I have no thought, no view, no hope in life beyond her, and if you oppose me in this great stake, you take my peace and happiness in your hands and cast them to the wind. Mother, think better of this and of me, and do not disregard the happiness of which you seem to think so little." "Harry," said Mrs. Maylie, "it is because I think so much of warm and sensitive hearts that I would spare them from being wounded. But we have said enough, and more than enough, on this matter just now." "Let it rest with Rose, then," interposed Harry. "You will not press these overstrained opinions of yours so far as to throw any obstacle in my way?" "I will not," rejoined Mrs. Maylie. "But I would have you consider—" "I have considered," was the impatient reply. "Mother, I have considered years and years. I have considered ever since I have been capable of serious reflection. My feelings remain unchanged, as they ever will, and why should I suffer a pain of delay in giving them vent, which can be productive of no earthly good? No, before I leave this place, Rose shall hear me." "She shall," said Mrs. Maylie. "There is something in your manner which would almost imply that she will hear me coldly, mother," said the young man. "Not coldly," rejoined the old lady. "Far from it." "How then?" urged the young man. "She has formed no other attachment." "No, indeed," replied his mother. "You have, or I mistake, too strong a hold on her affections already. What I would say," resumed the old lady, stopping her son as he was about to speak, "is this. Before you stake your all on this chance, before you suffer yourself to be carried to the highest point of hope, reflect for a few moments, my dear child, on Rose's history, and consider what effect the knowledge of her doubtful birth may have on her decision. Devoted as she is to us, with all the intensity of her noble mind, and with that perfect sacrifice of self which, in all matters, great or trifling, has always been her characteristic. What do you mean? That I leave you to discover, replied Mrs. Maylie. I must go back to her. God bless you. I shall see you again tonight, said the young man eagerly. By and by, replied the old lady, when I leave Rose. Will you tell her I am here? Said Harry. Of course, replied Mrs. Maylie. And say how anxious I have been, and how much I have suffered, and how I long to see her. You will not refuse to do this, mother? No, said the old lady. I will tell her all. And pressing her son's hand affectionately, she hastened from the room. Mr. Losberne and Oliver had remained at another end of the apartment while this hurried conversation was proceeding. The former now held out his hand to Harry Maylie, and hearty salutations were exchanged between them. The doctor then communicated, in reply to multifarious questions from his young friend, a precise account of his patient's situation, which was quite as consolatory and full of promise as Oliver's statement had encouraged him to hope, and to the whole of which Mr. Giles, who affected to be busy about the luggage, listened with greedy ears. "Have you shot anything particular lately, Giles?" inquired the doctor when he had concluded. "Nothing particular, sir," replied Mr. Giles, colouring up to the eyes. "Nor catching any thieves, nor identifying any housebreakers?" said the doctor. "Not at all, sir," replied Mr. Giles with much gravity. "Well," said the doctor, "I am sorry to hear it, because you do that sort of thing admirably. Pray, how is Brittles?" "The boy is very well, sir," said Mr. Giles, recovering his usual tone of patronage, "and sends his respectful duty, sir." "That's well," said the doctor. "Seeing you here reminds me, Mr. Giles, that on the day before that on which I was called away so hurriedly, I executed, at the request of your good mistress, a small commission in your favour. Just step into this corner a moment, will you?" Mr. Giles walked into the corner with much importance and some wonder, and was honoured with a short whispering conference with the doctor, on the termination of which he made a great many bows and retired with steps of unusual stateliness. The subject matter of this conference was not disclosed in the parlour, but the kitchen was speedily enlightened concerning it, for Mr. Giles walked straight thither, and having called for a mug of ale, announced with an air of majesty, which was highly effective, that it had pleased his mistress, in consideration of his gallant behaviour on the occasion of that attempted robbery, to deposit in the local savings bank the sum of £25, for his sole use and benefit. At this the two women servants lifted up their hands and eyes, and supposed that Mr. Giles would begin to be quite proud now, whereunto Mr. Giles, pulling out his shirt frill, replied, "No, no," and that if they observed that he was at all haughty to his inferiors, he would thank them to tell him so. And then he made a great many other remarks, no less illustrative of his humility, which were received with equal favour and applause, and wherewithal as original and as much to the purpose as the remarks of great men commonly are. Above stairs the remainder of the evening passed cheerfully away, for the doctor was in high spirits, and however fatigued or thoughtful Harry Maylie might have been at first, he was not proof against the worthy gentleman's good humour, which displayed itself in a great variety of sallies and professional recollections, and an abundance of small jokes, which struck Oliver as being the drollest things he had ever heard, and caused him to laugh proportionately, to the evident satisfaction of the doctor, who laughed immoderately at himself, and made Harry laugh almost as heartily by the very force of sympathy. So they were as pleasant a party as, under the circumstances, they could well have been, and it was late before they retired with light and thankful hearts to take that rest which, after the doubt and suspense they had recently undergone, they stood much in need. Oliver rose next morning in better heart, and went about his usual occupations with more hope and pleasure than he had known for many days. The birds were once more hung out to sing in their old places, and the sweetest wild flowers that could be found were once more gathered to gladden Rose with their beauty. The melancholy which had seemed to the sad eyes of the anxious boy to hang for days past over every object, beautiful as all were, was dispelled by magic. The dew seemed to sparkle more brightly on the green leaves, the air to rustle among them with a sweeter music, and the sky itself to look more blue and bright. Such is the influence which the condition of our own thoughts exercise even over the appearance of external objects. Men who look on nature and their fellow men, and cry that all is dark and gloomy, are in the right, but the sombre colours are reflections from their own jaundiced eyes and hearts. The real hues are delicate and need a clearer vision. It is worthy of remark, and Oliver did not fail to note it at the time, that his morning expeditions were no longer made alone. Harry Maylie, after the very first morning when he met Oliver coming laden home, was seized with such a passion for flowers, and displayed such a taste in their arrangement, as left his young companion far behind. If Oliver were behindhand in these respects, he knew where the best were to be found, and morning after morning they scoured the country together, and brought home the fairest that blossomed. The window of the young lady's chamber was opened now, for she loved to feel the rich summer air stream in, and revive her with its freshness. But there always stood in water, just inside the lattice, one particular little bunch, which was made up with great care every morning. Oliver could not help noticing that the withered flowers were never thrown away, although the little vase was regularly replenished, nor could he help observing that whenever the doctor came into the garden, he invariably cast his eyes up to that particular corner, and nodded his head most expressively, as he set forth on his morning's walk. Pending these observations, the days were flying by, and Rose was rapidly recovering. Nor did Oliver's time hang heavy on his hands, although the young lady had not yet left her chamber, and there were no evening walks, save now and then for a short distance with Mrs. Maylie. He applied himself with redoubled assiduity to the instructions of the white-headed old gentleman, and laboured so hard that his quick progress surprised even himself. It was while he was engaged in this pursuit that he was greatly startled and distressed by a most unexpected occurrence. The little room in which he was accustomed to sit when busy at his books was on the ground floor at the back of the house. It was quite a cottage room, with a lattice window around which were clusters of jessamine and honeysuckle, that crept over the casement and filled the place with their delicious perfume. It looked into a garden, whence a wicket gate opened into a small paddock. All beyond was fine meadowland and wood. There was no other dwelling near in that direction, and the prospect it commanded was very extensive. One beautiful evening, when the first shades of twilight were beginning to settle upon the earth, Oliver sat at this window, intent upon his books. He had been poring over them for some time, and as the day had been uncommonly sultry and he had exerted himself a great deal, it is no disparagement to the authors, whoever they may have been, to say that gradually and by slow degrees he fell asleep. There is a kind of sleep that steals upon us sometimes, which, while it holds the body prisoner, does not free the mind from a sense of things about it, and enable it to ramble at its pleasure. So far as an overpowering heaviness, a prostration of strength, and an utter inability to control our thoughts or power of motion can be called sleep, this is it. And yet we have a consciousness of all that is going on about us, and if we dream at such a time, words which are really spoken, or sounds which really exist at the moment, accommodate themselves with surprising readiness to our visions, until reality and imagination become so strangely blended that it is afterwards almost a matter of impossibility to separate the two. Nor is this the most striking phenomenon incidental to such a state. It is an undoubted fact that although our senses of touch and sight be for the time dead, yet our sleeping thoughts and the visionary scenes that pass before us will be influenced, and materially influenced, by the mere silent presence of some external object, which may not have been near us when we closed our eyes, and of whose vicinity we have had no waking consciousness. Oliver knew perfectly well that he was in his own little room, that his books were lying on the table before him, that the sweet air was stirring among the creeping plants outside, and yet he was asleep. Suddenly the scene changed. The air became close and confined, and he thought, with a glow of terror, that he was in the Jew's house again. There sat the hideous old man in his accustomed corner, pointing at him and whispering to another man with his face averted, who sat beside him. "Hush, my dear," he thought he heard the Jew say. "It is he, sure enough. Come away." "He?" the other man seemed to answer. "Could I mistake him, think you? If a crowd of ghosts were to put themselves into his exact shape, and he stood amongst them, There is something that would tell me how to point him out. If you buried him 50 feet deep and took me across his grave, I fancy I should know, if there wasn't a mark above it, that he lay buried there." The man seemed to say this with such dreadful hatred that Oliver awoke with the fear and started up. Good heaven, what was that which sent the blood tingling to his heart, and deprived him of his voice and of the power to move? There at the window, close before him, so close that he could have almost touched him before he started back, with his eyes peering into the room and meeting his, there stood the Jew, and beside him, white with rage or fear, or both, were the scowling features of the man who had accosted him in the inn-yard. It was but an instant, a glance, a flash before his eyes, and they were gone. But they had recognized him, and he them, and their look was firmly impressed upon his memory, as if it had been deeply carved in stone and set before him from his birth. He stood transfixed for a moment, then, leaping from the window into the garden, called loudly for help. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, containing the unsatisfactory result of Oliver's adventure, and a conversation of some importance between Harry Maylie and Rose. When the inmates of the house, attracted by Oliver's cries, hurried to the spot from which they proceeded, they found him pale and agitated, pointing in the direction of the meadows behind the house, and scarcely able to articulate the words, "The Jew! The Jew!" Mr. Giles was at a loss to comprehend what this outcry meant, but Harry Maylie, whose perceptions were something quicker, and who had heard Oliver's story from his mother, understood it at once. "What direction did he take?" he asked, catching up a heavy stick which was standing in a corner. "That," replied Oliver, pointing out the course the man had taken. "I missed them in an instant." "Then they're in the ditch," said Harry. "Follow, and keep as near me as you can." So saying, he sprang over the hedge and darted off with a speed which rendered it a matter of exceeding difficulty for the others to keep near him. Giles followed as well as he could, and Oliver followed too, and in the course of a minute or two Mr. Lostburn, who had been out walking and just then returned, tumbled over the hedge after them, and picking himself up with more agility than he could have been supposed to possess, struck into the same course at no contemptible speed, shouting all the while most prodigiously to know what was the matter. On they all went, nor stopped they once to breathe, until the leader, striking off into an angle of the field indicated by Oliver, began to search narrowly the ditch and hedge adjoining, which afforded time for the remainder of the party to come up, and for Oliver to communicate to Mr. Lostburn the circumstances that had led to so vigorous a pursuit. The search was all in vain. There were not even the traces of recent footsteps to be seen. They stood now on the summit of a little hill, commanding the open fields in every direction for 3 or 4 miles. There was the village in the hollow on the left, but in order to gain that, after pursuing the track Oliver had pointed out, the men must have made a circuit of open ground, which it was impossible they could have accomplished in so short a time. A thick wood skirted the meadowland in another direction, but they could not have gained that covert for the same reason. "It must have been a dream, Oliver," said Harry Maylie. "Oh, no indeed, sir," replied Oliver, shuddering at the very recollection of the old wretch's countenance. "I saw him too plainly for that. I saw them both as plainly as I see you now." "Who was the other?" inquired Harry and Mr. Lostburn together. "The very same man I told you of who came so suddenly upon me at the inn," said Oliver. "We had our eyes fixed full upon each other, and I could swear to him." "They took this way?" demanded Harry. "Are you sure?" "As I am that the men were at the window," replied Oliver, pointing down as he spoke to the hedge which divided the cottage garden from the meadow. "The tall man leaped over just there, and the Jew, running a few paces to the right, crept through that gap." The two gentlemen watched Oliver's earnest face as he spoke, and looking from him to each other, seemed to feel satisfied of the accuracy of what he said. Still, in no direction were there any appearances of the trampling of men in hurried flight. The grass was long, but it was trodden down nowhere, save where their own feet had crushed it. The sides and brinks of the ditches were of damp clay, but in no one place could they discern the print of men's shoes, or the slightest mark which would indicate that any feet had pressed the ground for hours before. "This is strange," said Harry. "Strange," echoed the doctor. "Blathers and Duff themselves could make nothing of it."
Notwithstanding the evidently useless nature of their search, they did not desist until the coming on of night rendered its further prosecution hopeless, and even then they gave it up with reluctance. Giles was dispatched to the different alehouses in the village, furnished with the best description Oliver could give of the appearance and dress of the strangers. Of these, the Jew was, at all events, sufficiently remarkable to be remembered, supposing he had been seen drinking or loitering about. But Giles returned without any intelligence calculated to dispel or lessen the mystery. On the next day fresh search was made, and the inquiries renewed, but with no better success. On the day following, Oliver and Mr. Maylie repaired to the market town, in the hope of seeing or hearing something of the men there, but this effort was equally fruitless. After a few days the affair began to be forgotten, as most affairs are, when wonder, having no fresh food to support it, dies away of itself. Meanwhile Rose was rapidly recovering. She had left her room, was able to go out, and mixing once more with the family, carried joy into the hearts of all. But although this happy change had a visible effect on the circle, and although cheerful voices and merry laughter were once more heard in the cottage, there was at times an unwonted restraint upon some there, even upon Rose herself, which Oliver could not fail to remark. Mrs. Maylie and her son were often closeted together for a long time, and more than once Rose appeared with traces of tears upon her face. After Mr. Losburn had fixed a day for his departure to Chertsey, these symptoms increased, and it became evident that something was in progress which affected the peace of the young lady, and of somebody else besides. At length one morning, when Rose was alone in the breakfast parlour, Harry Maylie entered, and with some hesitation begged permission to speak with her for a few moments. A very few will suffice, Rose," said the young man, drawing his chair towards her. "What I shall have to say has already presented itself to your mind. The most cherished hopes of my heart are not unknown to you, though from my lips you have not heard them stated." Rose had been very pale from the moment of his entrance, but that might have been the effect of her recent illness. She merely bowed, and bending over some plants that stood near her, waited in silence for him to proceed. I ought to have left here before," said Harry. "You should indeed," replied Rose. "Forgive me for saying so, but I wish you had." "I was brought here by the most dreadful and agonizing of all apprehensions," said the young man, "the fear of losing the one dear being on whom my every wish and hope are fixed. You had been dying, trembling between earth and heaven. We know that when the young, the beautiful, the good are visited with sickness, their pure spirits insensibly turn towards their bright home of lasting rest. We know, heaven help us, that the best and fairest of our kind too often fade in blooming." There were tears in the eyes of the gentle girl as these words were spoken, and when one fell upon the flower over which she bent, and glistened brightly in its cup, making it more beautiful, it seemed as though the outpouring of her fresh young heart claimed kindred naturally with the loveliest things in nature. "A creature," continued the young man passionately, "a creature as fair and innocent of guile as one of God's own angels, fluttered between life and death. Oh, who could hope, when the distant world to which she was akin half opened to her view, that she would return to the sorrow and calamity of this? Rose, Rose, to know that you were passing away like some soft shadow, which a light from above casts upon the earth, to have no hope that you would be spared to those who linger here, hardly to know a reason why you should be, to feel that you belong to that bright sphere whither so many of the fairest and the best have winged their early flight, and yet to pray, amid all these consolations, that you might be restored to those who loved you. These were distractions almost too great to bear. They were mine by day and by night, and with them came such a rushing torrent of fears and apprehensions, and selfish regrets, lest you should die, and never know how devotedly I love you, as almost bore down sense and reason in its course. You recovered, day by day, and almost hour by hour. Some drop of health came back, and mingling with the spent and feeble stream of life which circulated languidly about you, swelled it again to a high and rushing tide. I have watched you change almost from death to life, with eyes that turned blind with their eagerness and deep affection. Do not tell me that you wish I had lost this, for it has softened my heart to all mankind." "I did not mean that," said Rose, weeping. "I only wish you had left here, that you might have turned to high and noble pursuits again.
to pursuits well worthy of you." "There is no pursuit more worthy of me, more worthy of the highest nature that exists, than the struggle to win such a heart as yours," said the young man, taking her hand. "Rose, my own dear Rose, for years I have loved you, hoping to win my way to fame, and then come proudly home and tell you it had been pursued only for you to share. Thinking in my daydreams how I would remind you in that happy moment of the many silent tokens I had given of a boy's attachment, and claim your hand, as in redemption of some old mute contract that had been sealed between us. That time has not arrived, but here, with not fame won and no young vision realized, I offer you the heart so long your own, and stake my all upon the words with which you greet the offer." "Your behaviour has ever been kind and noble," said Rose, mastering the emotions by which he was agitated. "As you believe that I am not insensible or ungrateful, so hear my answer. It is that I may endeavour to deserve you. It is, dear Rose." "It is," replied Rose, "that you must endeavour to forget me, not as your old, dearly attached companion, for that would wound me deeply, but as the object of your love. Look into the world. Think how many hearts you would be proud to gain are there. Confide some other passion to me if you will. I will be the truest, warmest, and most faithful friend you have." There was a pause, during which Rose, who had covered her face with one hand, gave free vent to her tears. Harry still retained the other. "And your reasons, Rose," he said at length in a low voice. "Your reasons for this decision?" "You have a right to know them," rejoined Rose. "You can say nothing to alter my resolution. It is a duty that I must perform. I owe it alike to others and to myself." "To yourself?" "Yes, Harry. I owe it to myself that I, a friendless, portionless girl, with a blight upon my name, should not give your friends reason to suspect that I sordidly yielded to your first passion, and fastened myself, a clog, on all your hopes and projects. I owe it to you and yours to prevent you from opposing in the warmth of your generous nature this obstacle to your progress in the world." "If your inclinations chime in with your sense of duty," Harry began. "They do not," replied Rose, colouring deeply. "Then you return my love?" said Harry. "Say but that, dear Rose, say but that, and soften the bitterness of this hard disappointment." "If I could have done so without doing heavy wrong to him I loved," rejoined Rose, "I could have—" "Have received this declaration very differently," said Harry. "Do not conceal that from me at least, Rose." "I could," said Rose. "Stay," she added, disengaging her hand. "Why should we prolong this painful interview? Most painful to me, and yet productive of lasting happiness notwithstanding. For it will be happiness to know that I once held the high place in your regard which I now occupy, and every triumph you achieve in life will animate me with new fortitude and firmness. Farewell, Harry. As we have met today, we meet no more, but in other relations than those in which this conversation hath placed us, we may be long and happily entwined, and may every blessing that the prayers of a true and earnest heart can call down from the source of all truth and sincerity cheer and prosper you." "Another word, Rose," said Harry. "Your reason in your own words, from your own lips. Let me hear it." "The prospect before you," answered Rose firmly, "is a brilliant one. All the honours to which great talents and powerful connections can help men in public life are in store for you. But those connections are proud, and I will neither mingle with such as may hold in scorn the mother who gave me life, nor bring disgrace or failure on the son of her who has so well supplied that mother's place. In a word," said the young lady, turning away as her temporary firmness forsook her, "there is a stain upon my name which the world visits on innocent heads. I shall carry it into no blood but my own, and the reproach shall rest alone on me." "One more word, Rose, dearest Rose, one more," cried Harry, throwing himself before her. "If I had been less fortunate, the world would call it, if some obscure and peaceful life had been my destiny, if I had been poor, sick, and helpless, would you have turned from me then? Or has my probable advancement to riches and honour given this scruple birth?" "Do not press me to reply," answered Rose. "The question does not arise, and never will. It is unfair, almost unkind, to urge it." "If your answer be what I almost dare to hope it is," retorted Harry, "it will shed a gleam of happiness upon my lonely way, and light the path before me. It is not an idle thing to do so much by the utterance of a few brief words, for one who loves you beyond all else. Oh, Rose, in the name of my ardent and enduring attachment, in the name of all I have suffered for you, and all you doom me to undergo, answer me this one question." "Then, if your lot had been differently cast," rejoined Rose, "if you had been even a little, but not so far, above me, if I could have been a help and comfort to you in any humble scene of peace and retirement, and not a blot and drawback in ambitious and distinguished crowds, I should have been spared this trial. I have every reason to be happy, very happy now. But then, Harry, I own I should have been happier." Busy recollections of old hopes, cherished as a girl long ago, crowded into the mind of Rose while making this avowal. But they brought tears with them, as old hopes will when they come back withered, and they relieved her. "I cannot help this weakness, and it makes my purpose stronger," said Rose, extending her hand. "I must leave you now, indeed." "I ask one promise," said Harry. "Once, and only once more, say within a year, but it may be much sooner, I may speak to you again on this subject for the last time." "Not to press me to alter my right determination," replied Rose, with a melancholy smile. "It will be useless." "No," said Harry. "To hear you repeat it, if you will, finally repeat it. I will lay at your feet whatever of station or fortune I may possess, and if you still adhere to your present resolution, will not seek by word or act to change it." "Then let it be so," rejoined Rose. "It is but one pang the more, and by that time I may be enabled to bear it better." She extended her hand again, but the young man caught her to his bosom, and imprinting one kiss on her beautiful forehead, hurried from the room. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens is a very short one, and may appear of no great importance in its place, but it should be read notwithstanding as a sequel to the last and a key to the one that will follow when its time arrives. "And so you are resolved to be my travelling companion this morning, eh?" said the doctor, as Harry Maylie joined him and Oliver at the breakfast table. "Why, you are not in the same mind or intention 2 half-hours together." "You will tell me a different tale one of these days," said Harry, colouring without any perceptible reason. "I hope I may have good cause to do so," replied Mr. Losburn, "though I confess I don't think I shall. But yesterday morning you had made up your mind in a great hurry to stay here, and to accompany your mother like a dutiful son to the seaside. Before noon you announced that you were going to do me the honour of accompanying me as far as I go on your road to London, and at night you urged me with great mystery to start before the ladies are stirring. The consequence of which is that young Oliver here is pinned down to his breakfast when he ought to be ranging the meadows after botanical phenomena of all kinds. Too bad, isn't it, Oliver?" "I should have been very sorry not to have been at home when you and Mr. Maylie went away, sir," rejoined Oliver. "That's a fine fellow," said the doctor. "You shall come and see me when you return. But to speak seriously, Harry, has any communication from the great Nobs produced this sudden anxiety on your part to be gone?" "The great Nobs," replied Harry, "under which designation I presume you include my most stately uncle, have not communicated with me at all since I have been here, nor at this time of year is it likely that anything would occur to render necessary my immediate attendance among them." "Well," said the doctor, "you are a queer fellow. But of course they will get you into Parliament at the election before Christmas, and these sudden shiftings and changes are no bad preparation for political life. There's something in that. Good training is always desirable, whether the race be for place, cup, or sweepstakes." Harry Maylie looked as if he could have followed up this short dialogue by one or two remarks that would have staggered the doctor not a little, but he contented himself with saying, "We shall see," and pursued the subject no further. The post-chaise drove up to the door shortly afterwards, and Giles coming in for the luggage, the good doctor bustled out to see it packed. "Oliver," said Harry Maylie in a low voice, "let me speak a word with you." Oliver walked into the window recess to which Mr. Maylie beckoned him, much surprised at the mixture of sadness and boisterous spirits which his whole behaviour displayed. "You can write well now?" said Harry, laying his hand upon his arm. "I hope so, sir," replied Oliver. "I shall not be at home again, perhaps, for some time. I wish you would write to me, say once a fortnight, every alternate Monday, to the General Post Office in London. Will you?" "Oh, certainly, sir. I shall be proud to do it," exclaimed Oliver, greatly delighted with the commission. "I should like to know how—" how my mother and Miss Maylie are," said the young man, "and you can fill up a sheet by telling me what walks you take, and what you talk about, and whether they, I mean, seem happy and quite well. You understand me?" "Oh, quite, sir, quite," replied Oliver. "I would rather you did not mention it to them," said Harry, hurrying over his words, "because it might make my mother anxious to write to me oftener, and it is a trouble and worry to her. Let it be a secret between you and me, and mind you tell me everything. I depend upon you." Oliver, quite elated and honoured by a sense of his importance, faithfully promised to be secret and explicit in his communications. Mr. Maylie took leave of him, with many assurances of his regard and protection. The doctor was in the chaise. Giles, who it had been arranged should be left behind, held the door open in his hand, and the women servants were in the garden looking on. Harry cast one slight glance at the latticed window and jumped into the carriage. "Drive on," he cried. "Hard, fast, full gallop. Nothing short of flying will keep pace with me to-day." "Hello!" cried the doctor, letting down the front glass in a great hurry, and shouting to the postilion. "Something very short of flying will keep pace with me. Do you hear?" Jingling and clattering till distance rendered its noise inaudible, and its rapid progress only perceptible to the eye, the vehicle wound its way along the road, almost hidden in a cloud of dust, now wholly disappearing, and now becoming visible again as intervening objects or the intricacies of the way permitted. It was not until even the dusty cloud was no longer to be seen that the gazers dispersed. And there was one looker-on who remained with eyes fixed upon the spot where the carriage had disappeared long after it was many miles away, for behind the white curtain which had shrouded her from view when Harry raised his eyes towards the window sat Rose herself. "He seems in high spirits and happy," she said at length. "I feared for a time he might be otherwise. I was mistaken. I am very, very glad." Tears are signs of gladness as well as grief, but those which coursed down Rose's face as she sat pensively at the window, still gazing in the same direction, seemed to tell more of sorrow than of joy. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, in which the reader may perceive a contrast not uncommon in matrimonial cases. Mr. Bumble sat in the workhouse parlour with his eyes moodily fixed on the cheerless grate, whence, as it was summer-time, no brighter gleam proceeded than the reflection of certain sickly rays of the sun, which were sent back from its cold and shining surface. A paper fly-cage dangled from the ceiling, to which he occasionally raised his eyes in gloomy thought, and as the heedless insects hovered round the gaudy network, Mr. Bumble would heave a deep sigh, while a more gloomy shadow overspread his countenance. Mr. Bumble was meditating. It might be that the insects brought to mind some painful passage in his own past life. Nor was Mr. Bumble's gloom the only thing calculated to awaken a pleasing melancholy in the bosom of a spectator. There were not wanting other appearances, and those closely connected with his own person, which announced that a great change had taken place in the position of his affairs. The laced coat and the cocked hat, where were they? He still wore knee-breeches and dark cotton stockings on his nether limbs, but they were not the breeches. His coat was wide-skirted, and in that respect like the coat, but oh, how different! The mighty cocked hat was replaced by a modest round one. Mr. Bumble was no longer a beadle. There are some promotions in life which, independent of the more substantial rewards they offer, acquire peculiar value and dignity from the coats and waistcoats connected with them. The field marshal has his uniform, a bishop his silk apron, a councillor his silk gown, a beadle his cocked hat. Strip the bishop of his apron, or the beadle of his hat and lace, what are they? Men, mere men. Dignity and even holiness too sometimes are more questions of coat and waistcoat than some people imagine. Mr. Bumble had married Mrs. Corney and was master of the workhouse. Another beadle had come into power. On him the cocked hat, gold-laced coat and staff had all three descended. "And tomorrow 2 months it was done," said Mr. Bumble with a sigh. "It seems a age." Mr. Bumble might have meant that he had concentrated a whole existence of happiness into the short space of 8 weeks. But the sigh, there was a vast deal of meaning in the sigh. "I sold myself," said Mr. Bumble, pursuing the same train of reflection, "for 6 teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a milk pot, with a small quantity of second-hand furniture and £20 in money. I went very reasonable. Cheap. Dirt cheap." "Cheap!" cried a shrill voice in Mr. Bumble's ear. "You would have been dear at any price, and dear enough I paid for you, Lord above knows that." Mr. Bumble turned and encountered the face of his interesting consort, who, imperfectly comprehending the few words she had overheard of his complaint, had hazarded the foregoing remark at a venture. "Mrs. Bumble, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble with a sentimental sternness. "Well?" cried the lady. "Have the goodness to look at me," said Mr. Bumble, fixing his eyes upon her. "If she stands such a eye as that," said Mr. Bumble to himself, "she can stand anything. It is a eye I never knew to fail with paupers. If it fails with her, my power is gone." Whether an exceedingly small expansion of eye be sufficient to quell paupers, who, being lightly fed, are in no very high condition, or whether the late Mrs. Corney was particularly proof against eagle glances, are matters of opinion. The matter of fact is that the matron was in no way overpowered by Mr. Bumble's scowl, but on the contrary treated it with disdain, and even raised a laugh thereat which sounded as though it were genuine. On accounting this most unexpected sound, Mr. Bumble looked first incredulous and afterwards amazed. He then relapsed into his former state, nor did he rouse himself until his attention was again awakened by the voice of his partner. "Are you going to sit there snoring all day?" inquired Mrs. Bumble. "I am going to sit here as long as I think proper, ma'am," rejoined Mr. Bumble, "and although I was not snoring, I shall snore, gape, sneeze, laugh, or cry, as the humour strikes me, such being my prerogative." "Your prerogative?" sneered Mrs. Bumble, with ineffable contempt. "I said the word, ma'am," said Mr. Bumble. "The prerogative of a man is to command." "And what's the prerogative of a woman, in the name of goodness?" cried the relict of Mr. Corney deceased. "To obey, ma'am," thundered Mr. Bumble. "Your late unfortunate husband should have taught it you, and then perhaps he might have been alive now. I wish he was, poor man." Mrs. Bumble, seeing at a glance that the decisive moment had now arrived, and that a blow struck for the mastership on one side or other must necessarily be final and conclusive, no sooner heard this allusion to the dead and gone than she dropped into a chair, and with a loud scream that Mr. Bumble was a hard-hearted brute, fell into a paroxysm of tears. But tears were not the things to find their way to Mr. Bumble's soul. His heart was waterproof. Like washable beaver hats that improve with rain, his nerves were rendered stouter and more vigorous by showers of tears, which, being tokens of weakness, and so far tacit admissions of his own power, pleased and exalted him. He eyed his good lady with looks of great satisfaction, and begged in an encouraging manner that she should cry her hardest, the exercise being looked upon by the faculty as strongly conducive to health. "It opens the lungs, washes the countenance, exercises the eyes, and softens down the temper," said Mr. Bumble, "so cry away." As he discharged himself of this pleasantry, Mr. Bumble took his hat from a peg, and putting it on rather rakishly on one side, as a man might who felt he had asserted his superiority in a becoming manner, thrust his hands into his pockets, and sauntered towards the door, with much ease and waggishness depicted in his whole appearance. Now Mrs. Corney that was had tried the tears because they were less troublesome than a manual assault, but she was quite prepared to make trial of the latter mode of proceeding, as Mr. Bumble was not long in discovering. The first proof he experienced of the fact was conveyed in a hollow sound, immediately succeeded by the sudden flying off of his hat to the opposite end of the room. This preliminary proceeding laying bare his head, the expert lady, clasping him tightly round the throat with one hand, inflicted a shower of blows, dealt with singular vigour and dexterity, upon it with the other. This done, she created a little variety by scratching his face and tearing his hair, and having by this time inflicted as much punishment as she deemed necessary for the offence, she pushed him over a chair, which was luckily well situated for the purpose, and defied him to talk about his prerogative again if he dared. "Get up," said Mrs. Bumble in a voice of command, "and take yourself away from here, unless you want me to do something desperate." Mr. Bumble rose with a very rueful countenance, wondering much what something desperate might be. Picking up his hat, he looked towards the door. "Are you going?" demanded Mrs. Bumble. "Certainly, my dear, certainly," rejoined Mr. Bumble, making a quicker motion towards the door. "I didn't intend to. I'm going, my dear. You are so very violent that really I—" At this instant Mrs. Bumble stepped hastily forward to replace the carpet, which had been kicked up in the scuffle. Mr. Bumble immediately darted out of the room, without bestowing another thought on his unfinished sentence, leaving the late Mrs. Corney in full possession of the field. Mr. Bumble was fairly taken by surprise and fairly beaten. He had a decided propensity for bullying, derived no inconsiderable pleasure from the exercise of petty cruelty, and consequently was, it is needless to say, a coward. This is by no means a disparagement to his character, for many official personages who are held in high respect and admiration are the victims of similar infirmities. The remark is made, indeed, rather in his favour than otherwise, and with a view of impressing the reader with a just sense of his qualifications for office. But the measure of his degradation was not yet full. After making a tour of the house and thinking for the first time that the poor laws really were too hard on people, and that men who ran away from their wives, leaving them chargeable to the parish, ought in justice to be visited with no punishment at all, but rather rewarded as meritorious individuals who had suffered much, Mr. Bumble came to a room where some of the female paupers were usually employed in washing the parish linen, where the sound of voices and conversation now proceeded. "Ahem," said Mr. Bumble, summoning up all his native dignity. "These women at least shall continue to respect the prerogative. Hello there. What do you mean by this noise, you hussies?" With these words Mr. Bumble opened the door, and walked in with a very fierce and angry manner, which was at once exchanged for a most humiliated and cowering air, as his eyes unexpectedly rested on the form of his lady wife. "My dear," said Mr. Bumble, "I didn't know you were here." "Didn't know I was here?" repeated Mr. Bumble. "What do you do here?" "I thought they were talking rather too much to be doing their work properly, my dear," replied Mr. Bumble, glancing distractedly at a couple of old women at the wash-tub, who were comparing notes of admiration at the workhouse master's humility. "You thought they were talking too much," said Mrs. Bumble. "What business is it of yours?" "Why, my dear," urged Mr. Bumble submissively. "What business is it of yours?" demanded Mrs. Bumble again. "It's very true you're matron here, my dear," submitted Mr. Bumble, "but I thought you mightn't be in the way just then." "I'll tell you what, Mr. Bumble," returned his lady, "we don't want any of your interference. You're a great deal too fond of poking your nose into things that don't concern you, making everybody in the house laugh the moment your back is turned, and making yourself look like a fool every hour in the day. Be off, come." Mr. Bumble, seeing with excruciating feelings the delight of the two old paupers, who were tittering together most rapturously, hesitated for an instant. Mrs. Bumble, whose patience brooked no delay, caught up a bowl of soap-suds, and motioning him towards the door, ordered him instantly to depart, on pain of receiving the contents upon his portly person. What could Mr. Bumble do? He looked dejectedly round, and slunk away, and as he reached the door, the titterings of the paupers broke into a shrill chuckle of irrepressible delight. It wanted but this. He was degraded in their eyes. He had lost caste and station before the very paupers. He had fallen from all the height and pomp of beadleship to the lowest depth of the most snubbed henpeckery. "All in 2 months," said Mr. Bumble, filled with dismal thoughts. 2 months! No more than 2 months ago I was not only my own master but everybody else's, so far as the parochial workhouse was concerned, and now— It was too much. Mr. Bumble boxed the ears of the boy who opened the gate for him, for he had reached the portal in his reverie, and walked distractedly into the street. He walked up one street and down another until exercise had abated the first passion of his grief, and then the revulsion of feeling made him thirsty. He passed a great many public houses, but at length paused before one in a byway, whose parlour, as he gathered from a hasty peep over the blinds, was deserted, save by one solitary customer. It began to rain heavily at the moment. This determined him. Mr. Bumble stepped in, and ordering something to drink as he passed the bar, entered the apartment into which he had looked from the street. The man who was seated there was tall and dark, and wore a large cloak. He had the air of a stranger, and seemed, by a certain haggardness in his look, as well as by the dusty soils on his dress, to have travelled some distance. He eyed Bumble askance as he entered, but scarcely deigned to nod his head in acknowledgment of his salutation. Mr. Bumble had quite dignity enough for two, supposing even that the stranger had been more familiar. So he drank his gin and water in silence, and read the paper with a great show of pomp and circumstance. It so happened, however, as it will happen very often when men fall into company under such circumstances, that Mr. Bumble felt every now and then a powerful inducement, which he could not resist, to steal a look at the stranger, and that whenever he did so, he withdrew his eyes in some confusion to find that the stranger was at that moment stealing a look at him. Mr. Bumble's awkwardness was enhanced by the very remarkable expression of the stranger's eye, which was keen and bright, but shadowed by a scowl of distrust and suspicion, unlike anything he had ever observed before, and repulsive to behold. When they had encountered each other's glance several times in this way, the stranger, in a harsh, deep voice, broke silence. "Were you looking for me," he said, "when you peered in at the window?" "Not that I am aware of, unless you're Mr.—" Here Mr. Bumble stopped short, for he was curious to know the stranger's name, and thought in his impatience he might supply the blank. "I see you are not," said the stranger, an expression of quiet sarcasm playing about his mouth, "or you'd have known my name. You don't know it. I would recommend you not to ask for it." "I meant no harm, young man," observed Mr. Bumble majestically. "And have done none," said the stranger. Another silence succeeded this short dialogue, which was again broken by the stranger. "I have seen you before, I think," said he. "You were differently dressed at that time, and I only passed you in the street, but I should know you again. You were a beadle here once, were you not?" "I was," said Mr. Bumble in some surprise. "A parochial beadle." "Just so," rejoined the other, nodding his head. "It was in that character I saw you. What are you now?" "Master of the workhouse," rejoined Mr. Bumble, slowly and impressively, to check any undue familiarity the stranger might otherwise assume. "A master of the workhouse, young man." "You have the same eye to your own interest that you always had, I doubt not," resumed the stranger, keenly looking into Mr. Bumble's eyes as he raised them in astonishment at the question. "Don't scruple to answer freely, man. I know you pretty well, you see." "I suppose a married man," replied Mr. Bumble, shading his eyes with his hand, and surveying the stranger from head to foot in evident perplexity, "is not more averse to turning an honest penny when he can than a single one. Parochial officers are not so well paid that they can afford to refuse any little extra fee, when it comes to them in a civil and proper manner." The stranger smiled and nodded his head again, as much to say he had not mistaken his man. Then he rang the bell. "Fill this glass again," he said, handing Mr. Bumble's empty tumbler to the landlord. "Let it be strong and hot. You like it so, I suppose?" "Not too strong," replied Mr. Bumble, with a delicate cough. "You understand what that means, landlord," said the stranger dryly. The host smiled, disappeared, and shortly afterwards returned with a steaming jorum, of which the first gulp brought the water to Mr. Bumble's eyes. "Now, listen to me," said the stranger, after closing the door and window. "I came down to this place today to find you out. And by one of those chances which the devil throws in the way of his friends sometimes, you walked into the very room I was sitting in, while you were uppermost in my mind. I want some information from you. I don't ask you to give it for nothing, slight as it is. Put up that to begin with." As he spoke, he pushed a couple of sovereigns across the table to his companion, carefully, as though unwilling that the clinking of money should be heard without. When Mr. Bumble had scrupulously examined the coins to see that they were genuine, and had put them up with much satisfaction in his waistcoat pocket, he went on. "Carry your memory back. Let me see. 12 years last winter." "It's a long time," said Mr. Bumble. "Very good. I've done it." "The scene, the workhouse." "Good." "And the time, night." "Yes." "And the place, the crazy hole, wherever it was, in which miserable drabs brought forth the life and health so often denied to themselves, gave birth to puling children for the parish to rear, and hither shame, rot 'em in the grave." "The lying-in room, I suppose," said Mr. Bumble, not quite following the stranger's excited description. "Yes," said the stranger. "A boy was born there." "A many boys," observed Mr. Bumble, shaking his head despondingly.
"A murrain on the young devils," cried the stranger. "I speak of one, a meek-looking, pale-faced boy who was prenticed down here to a coffin-maker. I wish he had made his coffin and screwed his body in it, and who afterwards ran away to London, as it was supposed." "Why, you mean Oliver, young Twist," said Mr. Bumble. "I remember him, of course. There wasn't an obstinate young rascal." "It's not of him I want to hear. I've heard enough of him," said the stranger, stopping Mr. Bumble in the outset of a tirade on the subject of poor Oliver's vices. "It's of a woman, the hag that nursed his mother. Where is she?" "Where is she?" said Mr. Bumble, whom the gin and water had rendered facetious. "It would be hard to tell. There's no midwifery there, whichever place she's gone to. So I suppose she's out of employment anyway." "What do you mean?" demanded the stranger sternly. "That she died last winter," rejoined Mr. Bumble. The man looked fixedly at him when he had given this information, and although he did not withdraw his eyes for some time afterwards, his gaze gradually became vacant and abstracted, and he seemed lost in thought. For some time he appeared doubtful whether he ought to be relieved or disappointed by the intelligence, but at length he breathed more freely, and withdrawing his eyes observed that it was no great matter. With that he rose as if to depart. But Mr. Bumble was cunning enough, and he at once saw that an opportunity was opened for the lucrative disposal of some secret in the possession of his better half. He well remembered the night of old Sally's death, which the occurrences of that day had given him good reason to recollect, as the occasion on which he had proposed to Mrs. Corney, and although that lady had never confided to him the disclosure of which she had been the solitary witness, he had heard enough to know that it related to something that had occurred in the old woman's attendance, as workhouse nurse, upon the young mother of Oliver Twist. Hastily calling this circumstance to mind, he informed the stranger with an air of mystery that one woman had been closeted with the old harridan shortly before she died, and that she could, as he had reason to believe, throw some light on the subject of his inquiry. "How can I find her?" said the stranger, thrown off his guard, and plainly showing that all his fears, whatever they were aroused afresh by this intelligence. "Only through me," rejoined Mr. Bumble. "When?" cried the stranger hastily. "Tomorrow," rejoined Bumble. "At 9 in the evening," said the stranger, producing a scrap of paper and writing down upon it an obscure address by the waterside, in characters that betrayed his agitation. "At 9 in the evening bring her to me here. I needn't tell you to be secret, it's your interest." With these words he led the way to the door, after stopping to pay for the liquor that had been drunk. Shortly remarking that the roads were different, he departed, without more ceremony than an emphatic repetition of the hour of appointment for the following night. On glancing at the address, the parochial functionary observed that it contained no name. The stranger had not gone far, so he made after him to ask it. "What do you want?" cried the man, turning quickly round as Bumble touched him on the arm. "Following me?" "Only to ask a question," said the other, pointing to the scrap of paper. "What name do I ask for?" "Monks," rejoined the man, and strode hastily away. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, containing an account of what passed between Mr. and Mrs. Bumble and Mr. Monks at their nocturnal interview. It was a dull, close, overcast summer evening. The clouds, which had been threatening all day, spread out in a dense and sluggish mass of vapour, already yielded large drops of rain, and seemed to presage a violent thunderstorm, when Mr. and Mrs. Bumble, turning out of the main street of the town, directed their course towards a scattered little colony of ruinous houses, distant from it some mile and a half or thereabouts, and erected on a low, unwholesome swamp bordering upon the river. They were both wrapped in old and shabby outer garments, which might perhaps serve the double purpose of protecting their persons from the rain, and sheltering them from observation. The husband carried a lantern, from which, however, no light yet shone, and trudged on a few paces in front, as though, the way being dirty, to give his wife the benefit of treading in his heavy footprints. They went on in profound silence. Every now and then Mr. Bumble relaxed his pace, and turned his head as if to make sure that his helpmate was following. Then, discovering that she was close at his heels, he mended his rate of walking and proceeded at a considerable increase of speed towards the place of destination.
It was far from being a place of doubtful character, for it had long been known as the residence of none but low ruffians who, under various pretences of living by their labour, subsisted chiefly on plunder and crime. It was a collection of mere hovels, some hastily built with loose bricks, others of old worm-eaten ship timber, jumbled together without any attempt at order or arrangement, and planted for the most part within a few feet of the river's bank. A few leaky boats drawn up on the mud and made fast to the dwarf wall which skirted it, and here and there an oar or coil of rope, appeared at first to indicate that the inhabitants of these miserable cottages pursued some avocation on the river, but a glance at the shattered and useless condition of the articles thus displayed would have led a passer-by without much difficulty to the conjecture that they were disposed there rather for the preservation of appearances than with any view to their actually being employed. In the heart of this cluster of huts and skirting the river, which its upper stories overhung, stood a large building, formerly used as a manufactory of some kind. It had in its day probably furnished employment to the inhabitants of the surrounding tenements, but it had long since gone to ruin. The rat, the worm, and the action of the damp had weakened and rotted the piles on which it stood, and a considerable portion of the building had already sunk down into the water, while the remainder, tottering and bending over the dark stream, seemed to wait a favourable opportunity of following its old companion, and involving itself in the same fate. It was before this ruinous building that the worthy couple paused, as the first peal of distant thunder reverberated in the air and the rain commenced pouring violently down. "The place should be somewhere here," said Bumble, consulting a scrap of paper in his hand. "Hello there," cried a voice from above. Following the sound, Mr. Bumble raised his head and descried a man looking out of a door breast high on the second story. "Stand still a minute," cried the voice. "I'll be with you directly," with which the head disappeared and the door closed. "Is that the man?" asked Mr. Bumble's good lady. Mr. Bumble nodded in the affirmative. "Then mind what I told you," said the matron, "and be careful to say as little as you can, or you'll betray us at once." Mr. Bumble, who had eyed the building with very rueful looks, was apparently about to express some doubts relative to the advisability of proceeding any further with the enterprise just then, when he was prevented by the appearance of Monks, who opened a small door near which they stood and beckoned them inwards. "Come in," he cried impatiently, stamping his foot on the ground. "Don't keep me here." The woman, who had hesitated at first, walked boldly in without any other invitation. Mr. Bumble, who was ashamed or afraid to lag behind, followed, obviously very ill at ease and with scarcely any of that remarkable dignity which was usually his chief characteristic. "What the devil made you stand there lingering in the wet?" said Monks, turning round and addressing Bumble after he had bolted the door behind them. We were only cooling ourselves," stammered Mr. Bumble, looking apprehensively about him. "Cooling yourselves?" retorted Monks. "Not all the rain that ever fell or ever will fall will put as much of hellfires out as a man can carry about with him. You won't cool yourself so easily, don't think it." With this agreeable speech, Monks turned short upon the matron, and bent his gaze upon her, till even she, who was not easily cowed, was fain to withdraw her eyes and turn them towards the ground. "This is the woman, is it?" demanded Monks. "That is the woman," replied Mr. Bumble, mindful of his wife's caution. "You think women can never keep secrets, I suppose?" said the matron, interposing, and returning as she spoke the searching look of Monks. "I know they will always keep one till it's found out," said Monks. "And what may that be?" asked the matron. "The loss of their own good name," replied Monks. "So, by the same rule, if a woman's a party to a secret that might hang or transport her, I'm not afraid of her telling it to anybody, not I. Do you understand, mistress?" "No," rejoined the matron, slightly colouring as she spoke. "Of course you don't," said Monks. "How should you?" Bestowing something halfway between a smile and a frown upon his two companions, and again beckoning them to follow, the man hastened across the apartment, which was of considerable extent, but low in the roof. He was preparing to ascend a steep staircase, or rather ladder, leading to another floor of warehouses above, when a bright flash of lightning streamed down the aperture, and a peal of thunder followed which shook the crazy building to its centre. "Hear it! he cried, shrinking back. Hear it, rolling and crashing on as if it echoed through 1,000 caverns where the devils were hiding from it. I hate the sound. He remained silent for a few moments, and then, removing his hand suddenly from his face, showed to the unspeakable discomposure of Mr. Bumble that it was much distorted and discoloured. "These fits come over me now and then," said Monks, observing his alarm, "and thunder sometimes brings them on. Don't mind me now. It's all over for this once." Thus speaking, he led the way up the ladder, and hastily closing the window shutter of the room into which it led, lowered a lantern which hung at the end of a rope and pulley passed through one of the heavy beams in the ceiling, and which cast a dim light upon an old table and 3 chairs that were placed beneath it. "Now," said Monks, when they had all 3 seated themselves, "the sooner we come to our business the better for all. The woman knows what it is, does she?" This question was addressed to Bumble, but his wife anticipated the reply by intimating that she was perfectly acquainted with it. "He is right in saying that you were with his hag the night she died, and that she told you something?" "About the mother of the boy you named," replied the matron, interrupting him. "Yes." "The first question is, of what nature was her communication?" said Monks. "That's the second," observed the woman with much deliberation. "The first is, of what may the communication be worth?" "Who the devil can tell that, without knowing what kind it is?" asked Monks. "Nobody better than you, I am persuaded," answered Mrs. Bumble, who did not want for spirit, as her yoke-fellow could abundantly testify. Said Monks significantly, and with a look of eager inquiry. "There may be money's worth to get, eh?" "Perhaps there may," was the composed reply. "Something that was taken from her," said Monks. "Something that you wore, something that—" "You had better bid," interrupted Mrs. Bumble. "I have heard enough already to assure me that you are the man I ought to talk to." Mr. Bumble, who had not yet been admitted by his better half into any greater share of the secret than he had originally possessed, listened to this dialogue with outstretched neck and distended eyes, which he directed towards his wife and Monks by turns, in undisguised astonishment, increased if possible when the latter sternly demanded what sum was required for the disclosure. "What's it worth to you?" asked the woman, as collectedly as before. "It may be nothing, it may be £20, replied Monks. "Speak out and let me know which." "Add £5 to the sum you have named. Give me £25 in gold," said the woman, "and I'll tell you all I know. Not before." £25! exclaimed Monks, drawing back. "I spoke as plainly as I could," replied Mrs. Bumble. "It's not a large sum either." "Not a large sum for a paltry secret that may be nothing when it's told," cried Monks impatiently, "and which has been lying dead for 12 years past or more." "Such matters keep well, and like good wine often double their value in course of time," answered the matron, still preserving the resolute indifference she had assumed. "As to lying dead, there are those who will lie dead for 12,000 years to come, or 12,000,000, for anything you or I know, who will tell strange tales at last." "What if I pay it for nothing?" asked Monks, hesitating. "You can easily take it away again," replied the matron. "I am but a woman, alone here and unprotected." "Not alone, my dear, nor unprotected, neither," submitted Mr. Bumble, in a voice tremulous with fear. "I am here, my dear. And besides," said Mr. Bumble, his teeth chattering as he spoke, "Mr. Monks is too much of a gentleman to attempt any violence of parochial persons. Mr. Monks is aware that I am not a young man, my dear, and also that I am a little run to seed, as I may say. But he has heard, I say I have no doubt Mr. Monks has heard, my dear, that I am a very determined officer, with very uncommon strength, if I am once roused. I only want a little rousing, that's all." As Mr. Bumble spoke, he made a melancholy feint of grasping his lantern with fierce determination, and plainly showed by the alarmed expression of every feature that he did want a little rousing, and not a little, prior to making any very warlike demonstration, unless indeed against paupers or other person or persons trained down for the purpose. "You're a fool," said Mrs. Bumble in reply, "and had better hold your tongue." "He had better have it cut out before he came, if he can't speak in a lower tone," said Monks grimly. "So, he's your husband, eh?" "He? My husband?" tittered the matron, parrying the question. "I thought as much when you came in," rejoined Monks, remarking the angry glance which the lady darted at her spouse as she spoke. "So much the better. I have less hesitation in dealing with two people when I find there's only one will between them. I'm in earnest. See here." He He thrust his hand into a side pocket, and producing a canvas bag, told out 25 sovereigns on the table, and pushed them over to the woman. "Now," he said, "gather them up, and when this cursed peal of thunder, which I feel is coming up to break over the housetop, is gone, let's hear your story." The thunder, which seemed in fact much nearer, and to shiver and break almost over their heads, having subsided, Monks, raising his face from the table, bent forward to listen to what the woman should say. The faces of the three nearly touched, as the two men leant over the small table in their eagerness to hear, and the woman also leant forward to render her whisper audible. The sickly rays of the suspended lantern falling directly upon them aggravated the paleness and anxiety of their countenances, which, encircled by the deepest gloom and darkness, looked ghastly in the extreme. "When this woman that we called old Sally died," the matron began, "she and I were alone." "Was there no one by?" asked Monks in the same hollow whisper. "No sick wretch or idiot in some other bed? No one who could hear and might by possibility understand?" "Not a soul," replied the woman. "We were alone. I stood alone beside the body when death came over it." "Good," said Monks, regarding her attentively. "Go on." "She spoke of a young creature," resumed the matron, "who had brought a child into the world some years before, not merely in the same room, but in the same bed in which she then lay dying." "Aye," said Monks, with quivering lip and glancing over his shoulder. "Blood. How things come about." "The child was the one you named to him last night," said the matron, nodding carelessly towards her husband. "The mother this nurse had robbed." "In life?" asked Monks. "In death," replied the woman, with something like a shudder. "She stole from the corpse, when it had hardly turned to one, that which the dead mother had prayed her with her last breath to keep for the infant's sake." "She sold it?" cried Monks, with desperate eagerness. "Did she sell it? Where? When? To whom? How long before?" "As she told me with great difficulty that she had done this," said the matron, "she fell back and died." "Without saying more?" cried Monks, in a voice which, from its very suppression, seemed only the more furious. "It's a lie. I'll not be played with. She said more. I'll tear the life of both of you, but I'll know what it was." "She didn't utter another word," said the woman, to all appearance unmoved, as Mr. Bumble was very far from being, by the strange man's violence. "But she clutched my gown violently with one hand, which was partly closed, and when I saw that she was dead, and so removed the hand by force, I found it clasped a scrap of dirty paper." "Which contained?" interposed Monks, stretching forward. "Nothing," replied the woman. "It was a pawnbroker's duplicate." "For what?" demanded Monks. "In good time I'll tell you," said the woman. "I judged that she had kept the trinket for some time, in the hope of turning it to better account, and then had pawned it, and had saved or scraped together money to pay the pawnbroker's interest year by year, and prevent its running out, so that if anything came of it, it could still be redeemed. Nothing had come of it, and, as I tell you, she died with a scrap of paper, all worn and tattered, in her hand. The time was out in 2 days. I thought something might one day come of it too, and so redeemed the pledge." "Where is it now?" asked Monks quickly. "There," replied the woman. And, as if to be relieved of it, she hastily threw upon the table a small kid bag, scarcely large enough for a French watch, which Monks, pouncing upon, tore open with trembling hands. It contained a little gold locket, in which were 2 locks of hair and a plain gold wedding ring. "It has the word Agnes engraved on the inside," said the woman. "There is a blank left for the surname, and then follows the date, which is within a year before the child was born. I found that out." "And this is all," said Monks, after close and eager scrutiny of the contents of the little packet. "All," replied the woman. Mr. Bumble drew a long breath, as if he were glad to find that the story was over, and no mention made of taking the £25 back again. And now he took courage to wipe the perspiration which had been trickling over his nose, unchecked, during the whole of the previous dialogue. "I know nothing of the story beyond what I can guess at," said his wife, addressing Monks after a short silence. "And I want to know nothing, for it's safer not. But I may ask you 2 questions, may I?" "You may ask," said Monks, with some show of surprise, "but whether I answer or not is another question." "Which makes 3, observed Mr. Bumble, essaying a stroke of facetiousness. "Is that what you expected to get from me?" demanded the matron. "It is," replied Monks. "The other question?" "What do you propose to do with it? Can it be used against me?" "Never," rejoined Monks, "nor against me either. See here, But don't move a step forward, or your life's not worth a bulrush." With these words he suddenly wheeled the table aside, and pulling an iron ring in the boarding, threw back a large trapdoor which opened close at Mr. Bumble's feet, and caused that gentleman to retire several paces backward, with great precipitation. "Look down," said Monks, lowering the lantern into the gulf. "Don't fear me. I could have let you down quietly enough when you were seated over it, if that had been my game." Thus encouraged, the matron drew near to the brink, and even Mr. Bumble himself, impelled by curiosity, ventured to do the same. The turbid water, swollen by the heavy rain, was rushing rapidly on below, and all other sounds were lost in the noise of its plashing and eddying against the green and slimy piles. There had once been a water-mill beneath. The tide, foaming and chafing round the few rotten stakes and fragments of machinery that yet remained, seemed to dart onward with a new impulse when freed from the obstacles which had unavailingly attempted to stem its headlong course. "If you flung a man's body down there, where would it be tomorrow morning?" said Monks, swinging the lantern to and fro in the dark well. 12 miles down the river, and cut to pieces besides," replied Bumble, recoiling at the thought. Monks drew the little packet from his breast where he had hurriedly thrust it, and tying it to a leaden weight, which had formed a part of some pulley and was lying on the floor, dropped it into the stream. It fell straight and true as a die, clove the water with a scarcely audible splash, and was gone. The three, looking into each other's faces, seemed to breathe more freely. "There," said Monks, closing the trapdoor, which fell heavily back into its former position. "If the sea ever gives up its dead, as books say it will keep its gold and silver to itself, and that trash among it. We have nothing more to say, and may break up our pleasant party." "By all means," observed Mr. Bumble with great alacrity. "You keep a quiet tongue in your head, will you?" said Monks with a threatening look. "I am not afraid of your wife." "You may depend upon me, young man," answered Mr. Bumble, bowing himself gradually towards the ladder with excessive politeness. "On everybody's account, young man. On my own account, you know, Mr. Monks." "I am glad for your sake to hear it," remarked Monks. "Light your lantern and get away from here as fast as you can." It was fortunate that the conversation terminated at this point, or Mr. Bumble, who had bowed himself to within 6 inches of the ladder, would infallibly have pitched headlong into the room below. He lighted his lantern from that which Monks had detached from the rope and now carried in his hand, and making no effort to prolong the discourse, descended in silence, followed by his wife. Monks brought up the rear after pausing on the steps to satisfy himself that there were no other sounds to be heard than the beating of the rain without and the rushing of the water. They traversed the lower room slowly and with caution, for Monks started at every shadow, and Mr. Bumble, holding his lantern a foot above the ground, walked not only with remarkable care, but with a marvellously light step for a gentleman of his figure, looking nervously about him for hidden trapdoors. The gate at which they had entered was softly unfastened and opened by Monks. Merely exchanging a nod with their mysterious acquaintance, the married couple emerged into the wet and darkness outside. They were no sooner gone than Monks, who appeared to entertain an invincible repugnance to being left alone, called to a boy who had been hidden somewhere below. Bidding him to go first and bear the light, he returned to the chamber he had just quitted. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens introduces some respectable characters with whom the reader is already acquainted, and shows how Monks and the Jew laid their worthy heads together. On the evening following that upon which the three worthies mentioned in the last chapter disposed of their little matter of business as therein narrated, Mr. William Sikes, awakening from a nap, drowsily growled forth an inquiry what time of night it was. The room in which Mr. Sikes propounded this question was not one of those he had tenanted previous to the Chertsey expedition, although it was in the same quarter of the town, and was situated at no great distance from his former lodgings. It was not in appearance so desirable a habitation as his old quarters, being a mean and badly furnished apartment of very limited size, lighted only by one small window in the shelving roof, and abutting on a close and dirty lane. Nor were there wanting other indications of the good gentleman's having gone down in the world of late, for a great scarcity of furniture and total absence of comfort, together with the disappearance of all such small movables as spare clothes and linen, bespoke a state of extreme poverty, while the meagre and attenuated condition of Mr. Sikes himself would have fully confirmed these symptoms if they had stood in any need of corroboration. The housebreaker was lying on the bed, wrapped in his white greatcoat by way of dressing gown, and displaying a set of features in no degree improved by the cadaverous hue of illness, and the addition of a soiled nightcap and a stiff black beard of a week's growth. The dog sat at the bedside, now eyeing his master with a wistful look, and now pricking his ears and uttering a low growl as some noise in the street, or in the lower part of the house, attracted his attention. Seated by the window, busily engaged in patching an old waistcoat which formed a portion of the robber's ordinary dress, was a female, so pale and reduced with watching and privation that there would have been considerable difficulty in recognising her as the same Nancy who has already figured in this tale, but for the voice in which she replied to Mr. Sikes's question.
"Not long gone 7, said the girl. "How do you feel tonight, Bill?"
"As weak as water," replied Mr. Sikes with an imprecation on his eyes and limbs. "Here, lend us a hand and get me off this thundering bed anyhow." Illness had not improved Mr. Sikes's temper, for as the girl raised him up and led him to a chair, he muttered various curses on her awkwardness and struck her. "Whining, are you?" said Sikes. "Come, don't stand snivelling there. If you can't do anything better than that, cut off altogether, do you hear me?"
"I hear you,"
replied the girl, turning her face aside and forcing a laugh. "What fancy have you got into your head now?" "Oh, you've thought better of it, have you?" growled Sikes, marking the tear which trembled in her eye. "All the better for you, you have." "Why, you don't mean to say you'd be hard upon me tonight, Bill?" said the girl, laying her hand upon his shoulder. "No," cried Mr. Sikes. "Why not?"
"Such a number of nights," said the girl with a touch of woman's tenderness, which communicated something like sweetness of tone even to her voice. "Such a number of nights as I've been patient with you, nursing and caring for you, as if you had been a child. And this is the first that I've seen you like yourself. You wouldn't have served me as you did just now if you thought of that, would you? Come, say you wouldn't."
"Well, then," rejoined Mr. Sikes, "I wouldn't. Why, damn, now the girl's whining again."
"It's nothing," said the girl, throwing herself into a chair. "Don't you seem to mind me. It'll soon be over."
"What'll be over?" demanded Sikes in a savage voice. "What foolery are you up to now again? Get up and bustle about and don't come over me with your woman's nonsense."
At any other time this remonstrance and the tone in which it was delivered would have had the desired effect, but the girl, being really weak and exhausted, dropped her head over the back of the chair and fainted, before Mr. Sikes could get out a few of the appropriate oaths with which, on similar occasions, he was accustomed to garnish his threats. Not knowing very well what to do in this uncommon emergency, for Miss Nancy's hysterics were usually of that violent kind which the patient fights and struggles out of without much assistance, Mr. Sikes tried a little blasphemy, and finding that mode of treatment wholly ineffectual, called for assistance.
"What's the matter here, my dear?" said Fagin, looking in. "Lend a hand with the girl, can't you?" said Sikes impatiently. "Don't stand chattering and grinning at me."
With an exclamation of surprise, Fagin hastened to the girl's assistance, while Mr. John Dawkins, otherwise the Artful Dodger, who had followed his venerable friend into the room, hastily deposited on the floor a bundle with which he was laden, and snatching a bottle from the grasp of Master Charlie Bates, who came close at his heels, uncorked it in a twinkling with his teeth, and poured a portion of its contents down the patient's throat, previously taking a taste himself to prevent mistakes. "Give her a whiff of fresh air with the bellows, Charlie," said Mr. Dawkins, "and slap her hands, Fagin, while Bill undoes her petticoats." These united restoratives, administered with great energy, especially that department consigned to Master Bates, who appeared to consider his share in the proceedings a piece of unexampled pleasantry, were not long in producing the desired effect. The girl gradually recovered her senses, and staggering to a chair by the bedside, hid her face upon the pillow, leaving Mr. Sikes to confront the newcomers in some astonishment at their unlooked-for appearance.
"Why, what evil wind has blowed you here?" he asked Fagin.
"No evil wind at all, my dear, for evil winds blow nobody any good, and I've brought something good with me that you'll be glad to see. Don't you, my dear? Open the bundle and give Bill the little trifles that we spent all our money on this morning." In compliance with Mr. Fagin's request, the Artful untied his bundle, which was of large size and formed of an old tablecloth, and handed the articles it contained one by one to Charlie Bates,
who placed them on the table with various encomiums on their rarity and excellence. "Such a rabbit pie, Bill!" exclaimed that young gentleman, disclosing to view a huge pasty. "Such delicate creatures, with such tender limbs, Bill, that the very bones melt in your mouth, and there's no occasion to pick 'em. Half a pound of 7 and 6 green, so precious strong that if you mix it with boiling water, it'll go nigh to blow the lid of the teapot off. 1.5 pound of moist sugar that the niggers didn't work at all at afore they got it up to such a pitch of goodness, oh no. 2 half-quartern brands, pound of best fresh, piece of double Gloucester, and to wind it all up, some of the richest sort you ever lushed." Uttering this last panegyric, Master Bates produced from one of his extensive pockets a full-sized wine bottle, carefully corked, while Mr. Dawkins, at the same instant, poured out a wine-glass full of raw spirits from the bottle he carried, which the invalid tossed down his throat without a moment's hesitation. "Ah," said Fagin, rubbing his hands with great satisfaction. "You'll do, Bill. You'll do now." "Do?" exclaimed Mr. Sikes. "I might have been done for 20 times over afore you'd have done anything to help me. What do you mean by leaving a man in this state 3 weeks or more, you false-hearted vagabond?" "Only hearing, boys," said Fagin, shrugging his shoulders, "and us come to bring 'em all these beautiful things." "The things is well enough in their way," observed Mr. Sikes, a little soothed as he glanced over the table. "But what have you got to say for yourself? Why should you leave me here, down in the mouth, health, blunt, and everything else, and take no more notice of me all this mortal time than if I was that here dog? Drive him down, Charlie." "I never see such a jolly dog as that," cried Master Bates, doing as he was desired. "Smelling the grub like an old lady going to market. He'd make his fortune on the stage, that dog would, and revive the drama besides." "Hold your din!" cried Sikes, as the dog retreated under the bed, still growling angrily. "What have you got to say for yourself, you withered old fence, eh?" "I was away from London a week or more, my dear, on a plant," replied the Jew. "And what about the other fortnight?" demanded Sikes. "What about the other fortnight you have left me lying here like a sick rat in his hole?" "I couldn't help it, Bill. I can't go into a long explanation before company, but I couldn't help it, upon my honour." "Upon your what?" growled Sikes with excessive disgust. "Here, cut me off a piece of that pie, one of you boys, to take the taste of that out of my mouth, or it'll choke me dead." "Don't be out of temper, my dear," urged Fagin submissively. "I have never forgot you, Bill. Never once." "Ah, I'll pound that you aren't," replied Sikes with a bitter grin. "You've been scheming and plotting away every hour that I've laid shivering and burning here. And Bill was to do this, and Bill was to do that, and Bill was to do it all dirt cheap, as soon as he got well, and was quite poor enough for your work. If it hadn't been for the girl, I might have died." "There now, Bill," remonstrated Fagin, eagerly catching at the word. "If it hadn't been for the girl." "Who but poor old Fagin was the means of your having such a handy girl about you?" "He says true enough there," said Nancy, coming hastily forward. "Let him be, let him be." Nancy's appearance gave a new turn to the conversation, for the boys, receiving a sly wink from the wary old Jew, began to ply her with liquor, of which, however, she took very sparingly, while Fagin, assuming an unusual flow of spirits, gradually brought Mr. Sikes into a better temper, by affecting to regard his threats as a little pleasant banter, and moreover by laughing very heartily at one or two rough jokes which, after repeated applications of the spirit bottle, he condescended to make. "It's all very well," said Mr. Sikes, "but I must have some blunt from you tonight." "I haven't a piece of coin about me," replied the Jew. "Then you've got lots at home," retorted Sikes, "and I must have some from there." "Lots!" cried Fagin, holding up his hands. "I haven't so much as would—" "I don't know how much you've got, and I dare say you hardly know yourself, as it would take a pretty long time to count it," said Sikes. "But I must have some tonight, and that's flat." "Well, well," said Fagin with a sigh, "I'll send the artful round presently." "You won't do nothing of the kind," rejoined Mr. Sikes. "The artful's a deal too artful, and will forget to come or lose his way, or get dodged by the traps and so be prewented, or anything for an excuse if you put it up to him. Nancy shall go to the ken and fetch you, to make all sure, and I'll lie down and have a snooze while she's gone." After a great deal of haggling and squabbling, Fagin beat down the amount of the required advance from £5 to £3 4 and sixpence, protesting with many solemn asseverations that would leave him only 18 pence to keep house with. Mr. Sikes sullenly remarking that if he couldn't get any more he must be content with that. Nancy prepared to accompany him home, while the Dodger and Master Bates put the eatables in the cupboard. The Jew then, taking leave of his affectionate friend, returned homeward, attended by Nancy and the boys. Mr. Sikes meanwhile flinging himself on the bed, and composing himself to sleep away the time until the young lady's return. In due course they arrived at Fagin's abode, where they found Toby Crackit and Mr. Chitling intent upon their 15th game at cribbage, which it is scarcely necessary to say the latter gentleman lost, and with it his 15th and last sixpence, much to the amusement of his young friends. Mr. Crackit, apparently somewhat ashamed at being found relaxing himself with a gentleman so much his inferior in station and mental endowments, yawned, and inquiring after Sikes, took up his hat to go. "Has nobody been, Toby?" asked Fagin. "Not a living leg," answered Mr. Crackit, pulling up his collar. "It's been as dull as swipes. You ought to stand something handsome, Fagin, to recompense me for keeping house so long. Damn, I'm as flat as a juryman, and should have gone to sleep as fast as Newgate if I hadn't had the good nature to amuse this youngster. Horrid dull, I'm blessed if I ain't." With these and other ejaculations of the same kind, Mr. Toby Crackit swept up his winnings, and crammed them into his waistcoat pocket with a haughty air, as though such small pieces of silver were wholly beneath the consideration of a man of his figure. This done, he swaggered out of the room, with so much elegance and gentility that Mr. Chitling, bestowing numerous admiring glances on his legs and boots till they were out of sight, assured the company that he considered his acquaintance cheap at 15 sixpences an interview, and that he didn't value his losses the snap of his little finger. "What a rum chap you are, Tom," said Master Bates, highly amused by this declaration. "Not a bit of it," replied Mr. Chitling. "Am I, Fagin?" "A very clever fellow, my dear," said Fagin, patting him on the shoulder and winking to his other pupils. "And Mr. Crackit is a heavy swell, ain't he, Fagin?" asked Tom. "No doubt at all of that, my dear." "And it is a creditable thing to have his acquaintance, ain't it, Fagin?" pursued Tom. "Very much so indeed, my dear. They're only jealous, Tom, because he won't give it to them." "Ah," cried Tom triumphantly, "that's where it is. He has cleaned me out, but I can go and earn some more when I like, can't I, Fagin?" "To be sure you can, and the sooner you go the better, Tom. So make up your losses at once and don't lose any more time. Dodger, Charlie, it's time you're on the lay. Come, it's nearly 10 and nothing done yet." In obedience to this hint, the boys, nodding to Nancy, took up their hats and left the room, the Dodger and his vivacious friend indulging as they went in many witticisms at the expense of Mr. Chitling, in whose conduct, it is but justice to say, there was nothing very conspicuous or peculiar, inasmuch as there are a great number of spirited young bloods upon town who pay much higher price than Mr. Chitling for being seen in good society, and a great number of fine gentlemen composing the good society aforesaid, who established their reputation upon very much the same footing as Flash Toby Crackit. "Now," said Fagin when they had left the room, "I'll go and get you that cash, Nancy. This is only the key of a little cupboard where I keep a few odd things the boys get, my dear. I never lock up my money, for I've none to lock up, my dear. None to lock up. It's a poor trade, Nancy, and no thanks, but I'm fond of seeing the young people about me, and I bear it all. I bear it all. Hush," he said, hastily concealing the key in his breast. "Who's that? Listen." The girl, who was sitting at the table with her arms folded, appeared in no way interested in the arrival, or to care whether the person, whoever it was, came or went, until the murmur of a man's voice reached her ears. The instant she caught the sound, she tore off her bonnet and shawl with the rapidity of lightning, and thrust them under the table. The Jew turning round immediately afterwards, she muttered a complaint of the heat, in a tone of languor that contrasted very remarkably with the extreme haste and violence of this action, which, however, had been unobserved by Fagin, who had his back towards her at the time. "Ah," he whispered, as though nettled by the interruption, "it's the man I expected before. He's coming downstairs. Not a word about the money while he's here, Nance. He won't stop long. Not 10 minutes, my dear." Laying his skinny forefinger upon his lip, the Jew carried a candle to the door, as a man's step was heard on the stairs without. He reached it at the same moment as the visitor, who, coming hastily into the room, was close upon the girl before he observed her. It was Monks. "Only one of my young people," said Fagin, observing that Monks drew back on beholding a stranger. "Don't move, Nancy." The girl drew closer to the table, and glancing at Monks with an air of careless levity, withdrew her eyes. But as he turned towards Fagin, she stole another look, so keen and searching and full of purpose, that if there had been any bystander to observe the change, he could hardly have believed the two looks to have proceeded from the same person. "Any news?" inquired Fagin. "Great. And good," said Fagin, hesitating, as though he feared to vex the other man by being too sanguine. "Not bad, anyway," replied Monks with a smile. "I've been prompt enough this time. Let me have a word with you." The girl drew closer to the table and made no offer to leave the room, although she could see that Monks was pointing to her. The Jew, perhaps fearing she might say something aloud about the money if he endeavoured to get rid of her, pointed upward and took Monks out of the room. "Not that infernal hole we were in before," she could hear the man say as they went upstairs. Fagin laughed, and making some reply which did not reach her, seemed by the creaking of the boards to lead his companion to the second story. Before the sound of their footsteps had ceased to echo through the house, the girl had slipped off her shoes, and drawing her gown loosely over her head and muffling her arms in it, stood at the door listening with breathless interest. The moment the noise ceased, she glided from the room, ascended the stairs with incredible softness and silence, and was lost in the gloom above. The room remained deserted for a quarter of an hour or more. The girl glided back with the same unearthly tread, and immediately afterwards the two men were heard descending. Monks went at once into the street, and the Jew crawled upstairs again for the money. When he returned, the girl was adjusting her shawl and bonnet, as if preparing to be gone. "Why, Nance!" exclaimed the Jew, starting back as he put down the candle. "How pale you are!" "Pale?" echoed the girl, shading her eyes with her hands, as if to look steadily at him. "Quite horrible! What have you been doing to yourself?" "Nothing that I know of, except sitting in this close place for I don't know how long and all," replied the girl carelessly. "Come, let me get back, that's a dear." With a sigh for every piece of money, Fagin told the amount into her hand. They parted without more conversation, merely interchanging a good night. When the girl got into the open street, she sat down upon a doorstep, and seemed for a few moments wholly bewildered and unable to pursue her way. She suddenly arose, and hurrying on in a direction quite opposite to that in which Sikes was awaiting her return, quickened her pace until it gradually resolved into a violent run. After completely exhausting herself, she stopped to take breath, and as if suddenly recollecting herself, and deploring her inability to do something she was bent on, wrung her hands and burst into tears. It might be that her tears relieved her, or that she felt the full hopelessness of her condition, but she turned back, and hurrying with nearly as great rapidity in the contrary direction, partly to recover lost time and partly to keep pace with the violent current of her own thoughts, soon reached the dwelling where she had left the housebreaker. If she betrayed any agitation when she presented herself to Mr. Sikes, he did not observe it, for merely inquiring if she had brought the money, and receiving a reply in the affirmative, he uttered a growl of satisfaction, and placing his head upon the pillow, resumed the slumbers which her arrival had interrupted. It was fortunate for her that the possession of money occasioned him so much employment next day in the way of eating and drinking, and withal had so beneficial an effect in smoothing down the asperities of his temper, that he had neither time nor inclination to be very critical upon her behaviour and deportment. That she had all the abstracted and nervous manner of one who was on the eve of some bold and hazardous step, which it has required no common struggle to resolve upon, would have been obvious to the lynx-eyed Fagin, who would most probably have taken the alarm at once. But Mr. Sikes, lacking the niceties of discrimination, and being troubled with no more subtle misgivings than those which resolve themselves into a dogged roughness of behaviour towards everybody, being furthermore in an unusually amiable condition, as has already been observed, saw nothing unusual in her demeanour, and indeed troubled himself so little about her that had her agitation been far more perceptible than it was, it would have been very unlikely to have awakened his suspicions. As that day closed in, the girl's excitement increased. and when night came on, and she sat by, watching until the housebreaker should drink himself asleep, there was an unusual paleness in her cheek, and a fire in her eye that even Sikes observed with astonishment. Mr. Sikes, being weak from the fever, was lying in bed, taking hot water with his gin to render it less inflammatory, and had pushed his glass towards Nancy to be replenished for the third or fourth time, when these symptoms first struck him. "Why, burn my body," said the man, raising himself on his hands as he stared the girl in the face. "You look like a corpse come to life again. What's the matter?" "Matter?" replied the girl. "Nothing. What do you look at me so hard for?" "What foolery is this?" demanded Sikes, grasping her by the arm and shaking her roughly. "What is it? What do you mean? What are you thinking of?" "Of many things, Bill," replied the girl, shivering, and as she did so pressing her hands upon her eyes. "But Lord, what odds is that?" The tone of forced gaiety in which the last words were spoken seemed to produce a deeper impression on Sikes than the wild and rigid look which had preceded them. "I'll tell you what it is," said Sikes. "If you haven't caught the fever, and got it coming on now, there's something more than usual in the wind, and something dangerous too. You're not a-going to... Oh, damn, you wouldn't do that." "Do what?" asked the girl. "There ain't," said Sikes, fixing his eyes upon her and muttering the words to himself, "there ain't a stauncher-hearted gal going, or I'd have cut her throat 3 months ago. She's got the fever coming on, that's it." Fortifying himself with this assurance, Sikes drained the glass to the bottom, and then, with many grumbling oaths, called for his physic. The girl jumped up with great alacrity, poured it quickly out, but with her back towards him, and held the vessel to his lips while he drank off the contents. "Now," said the robber, "come and sit aside of me, and put on your own face, or I'll alter it so that you won't know it again when you do want it." The girl obeyed. Sikes, locking her hand in his, fell back upon the pillow, turning his eyes upon her face. They closed, opened again, closed once more, again opened. He shifted his position restlessly, and after dozing again and again for 2 or 3 minutes, and as often springing up with a look of terror and gazing vacantly about him, was suddenly stricken, as it were, while in the very attitude of rising, into a deep and heavy sleep. The grasp of his hand relaxed. The upraised arm fell languidly by his side, and he lay like one in a profound trance. "The laudanum has taken effect at last," murmured the girl as she rose from the bedside. "Or may be too late even now." She hastily dressed herself in her bonnet and shawl, looking fearfully round from time to time, as if, despite the sleeping draught, she expected every moment to feel the pressure of Sikes's heavy hand upon her shoulder. Then, stooping softly over the bed, she kissed the robber's lips, and then, opening and closing the room door with a noiseless touch, hurried from the house. A watchman was crying 9:30 down a dark passage through which she had to pass in gaining the main thoroughfare. "Is it long gone the half-hour?" asked the girl. "It'll strike the hour in another quarter," said the man, raising his lantern to her face. "And I cannot get there in less than an hour or more," muttered Nancy, brushing swiftly past him, and gliding rapidly down the street. Many of the shops were already closing in the back lanes and avenues through which she tracked her way, in making from Spitalfields towards the west end of London. The clock struck 10, increasing her impatience. She tore along the narrow pavement, elbowing the passengers from side to side, and darting almost under the horses' heads, crossing crowded streets, where clusters of persons were eagerly watching their opportunity to do the like. "The woman is mad," said the people, turning to look after her as she rushed away. When she reached the more wealthy quarter of the town, the streets were comparatively deserted, and here her headlong progress excited a still greater curiosity in the stragglers whom she hurried past. Some quickened their pace behind, as though to see whither she was hastening at such an unusual rate, and a few made head upon her, and looked back, surprised at her undiminished speed. But they fell off one by one, and when she neared her place of destination she was alone. It was a family hotel in a quiet but handsome street near Hyde Park. As the brilliant light of the lamp which burnt before its door guided her to the spot, the clock struck 11. She had loitered for a few paces, as though irresolute, and making up her mind to advance, but the sound determined her, and she stepped into the hall. The porter's seat was vacant. She looked round with an air of incertitude, and advanced towards the stairs. "Now, young woman," said a smartly dressed female, looking out from a door behind her, "what do you want here?" "A lady who was stopping in this house," answered the girl. "A lady?" was the reply, accompanied with a scornful look. "What lady?" "Miss Maylie," said Nancy. The young woman, who had by this time noted her appearance, replied only by a look of virtuous disdain, and summoned a man to answer her. To him Nancy repeated her request. "What name am I to say?" asked the waiter. "It's of no use saying any," replied Nancy. "No business?" said the man. "No, nor that neither," rejoined the girl. "I must see the lady." "Come," said the man, pushing her towards the door. "None of this. Take yourself off." "I shall be carried out if I go," said the girl violently, "and I can make that a job that two of you won't like to do. Isn't there anybody here," she said, looking round, "that will see a simple message carried for a poor wretch like me?" This appeal produced an effect on a good-tempered faced man-cook, who with some of the other servants was looking on, and who stepped forward to interfere. "Take it up for a joe, can't you?" said this person. "What's the good?" replied the man. "You don't suppose the young lady will see such as her, do you?" This allusion to Nancy's doubtful character raised a vast quantity of chaste wrath in the bosoms of 4 housemaids, who remarked with great fervour that the creature was a disgrace to her sex, and strongly advocated her being thrown ruthlessly into the kennel. "Do what you like with me," said the girl, turning to the men again, "but do what I ask you first, and I ask you to give this message for God Almighty's sake." The soft-hearted cook added his intercession, and the result was that the man who had first appeared undertook its delivery. "What's it to be?" said the man with one foot on the stairs. "That a young woman earnestly wants to speak to Miss Maylie alone," said Nancy, "and that if the lady will only hear the first word she has to say, she will know whether to hear her business or to have her turned out of doors as an impostor." "I say," said the man, "you're coming it strong." "You give the message," said the girl firmly, "and let me hear the answer." The man ran upstairs. Nancy remained pale and almost breathless, listening with quivering lips to the very audible expressions of scorn of which the chaste housemaids were very prolific, and of which they became still more so when the man returned and said the young woman was to walk upstairs. "It's no good being proper in this world," said the first housemaid. "Brass can do better than the gold what stood the fire," said the second. The third contented herself with wondering what ladies was made of, and the fourth took the first in a quartet of "shameful," with which the Dianas concluded. Regardless of all this, for she had weightier matters at heart, Nancy followed the man with trembling limbs into a small antechamber, lighted by a lamp from the ceiling. Here he left her and retired. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. A strange interview, which is a sequel to the last chapter. The girl's life had been squandered in the streets and among the most noisome of the stews and dens of London. But there was something of the woman's original nature left in her still, and when she heard a light step approaching the door opposite to that by which she had entered, and thought of the wide contrast which the small room would in another moment contain, she felt burdened with a sense of her own deep shame, and shrunk as though she could scarcely bear the presence of her with whom she had sought this interview. But struggling with these better feelings was pride, the vice of the lowest and most debased creatures, no less than of the high and self-assured. The miserable companion of thieves and ruffians, the fallen outcast of low haunts, the associate of the scourgings of the jails and hulks, living within the shadows of the gallows itself, even this degraded being felt too proud to betray a feeble gleam of the womanly feeling which she thought a weakness, but which alone connected her with that humanity of which her wasting life had obliterated so many, many traces when a very child. She raised her eyes sufficiently to observe that the figure which presented itself was that of a slight and beautiful girl. Then, bending them on the ground, she tossed her head with affected carelessness as she said, "It's a hard matter to get to see you, lady. If I had taken offence and gone away, as many would have done, you'd have been sorry for it one day, and not without reason either." "I am very sorry if anyone has behaved harshly to you," replied Rose. "Do not think of that. Tell me why you wish to see me. I am the person you inquired for." The kind tone of this answer, the sweet voice, the gentle manner, the absence of any accent of haughtiness or displeasure, took the girl completely by surprise, and she burst into tears. "No, lady," she said, clasping her hands passionately before her face. "If there was more like you, there would be fewer like me. There would. Sit down," said Rose earnestly. "If you are in poverty or affliction, I shall be truly glad to relieve you if I can. I shall indeed. Sit down." "Let me stand, lady," said the girl, still weeping, "and do not speak to me so kindly till you know me better. It is growing late. Is that door shut?" "Yes," said Rose, recoiling a few steps, as if to be nearer assistance in case she should require it. "Why?" "Because," said the girl, "I am about to put my life and the lives of others in your hands. I am the girl that dragged little Oliver back to old Fagin's on the night you went out of the house in Pentonville." "You?" said Rose Maylie. "Aye, lady," replied the girl. "I am the infamous creature you have heard of that lives among the thieves, and that never from the first moment I can recollect my eyes and senses opening on the streets of London have known any better life, or kinder words than they have given me, so help me God. Do not mind shrinking openly from me, lady. I am younger than you would think to look at me, but I am well used to it. The poorest women fall back as I make my way along the crowded pavement." "What dreadful things are these?" said Rose, involuntarily falling from her strange companion. "Thank heaven upon your knees, dear lady," cried the girl, "that you had friends to care for and keep you in your childhood, and that you were never in the midst of cold and hunger and riot and drunkenness, and something worse than all, as I have been from my cradle. I may use the word, for the alley and the gutter were mine, as they will be my deathbed." "I pity you," said Rose in a broken voice. "It wrings my heart to hear you." "Heaven bless you for your goodness," rejoined the girl. "If you knew what I am sometimes, you would pity me indeed. But I have stolen away from those who would surely murder me if they knew I had been here, to tell you what I have overheard. Do you know a man named Monks?" "No," said Rose. "He knows you," replied the girl, "and knew you were here, for it was by hearing him tell the place that I found you out." "I'd never heard the name," said Rose. "Then he goes by some other amongst us," rejoined the girl, "which I more than thought of before. Some time ago, and soon after Oliver was put into your house on the night of the robbery, I, suspecting this man, listened to a conversation held between him and Fagin in the dark. I found out from what I heard that Monks, the man I asked you about, you know—" "Yes," said Rose, "I understand." "That Monks," pursued the girl, "had seen him accidentally with two of our boys on the day we first lost him, and had known him directly to be the same child that he was watching for, though I couldn't make out why. A bargain was struck with Fagin that if Oliver was got back he should have a certain sum, and he was to have more for making him a thief, which this Monks wanted for some purpose of his own." "For what purpose?" asked Rose. "He caught sight of my shadow on the wall as I listened in the hope of finding out," said the girl, "and there are not many people besides me that could have got out of their way in time to escape discovery, but I did, and I saw no more till last night." "And what occurred then?" "I'll tell you, lady. Last night he came again. Again they went upstairs, and I, wrapping myself up so that my shadow would not betray me, again listened at the door. The first words I heard Monks say were these: 'So the only proofs of the boy's identity lie at the bottom of the river, and the old hag that received them from the mother is rotting in her coffin.' They laughed, and talked of his success in doing this, and Monks, talking on about the boy, and getting very wild, said that though he had got the young devil's money safely now, he'd rather have had it the other way, for what a game it would have been to have brought down the boast of the father's will by driving him through every jail in town, and then hauling him up for some capital felony which Fagin could easily manage, after having made a good profit of him besides." "What is all this?" said Rose. "The truth, lady, though it comes from my lips," replied the girl. "Then he said, with oaths common enough to my ears but strange to yours, that if he could gratify his hatred by taking the boy's life without bringing his own neck in danger, he would. But as he couldn't, he'd be upon the watch to meet him at every turn in life, and if he took advantage of his birth and history, he might harm him yet. In short, Fagin, he says, Jew as you are, you never laid such snares as I'll contrive for my young brother, Oliver." "His brother!" exclaimed Rose. "Those were his words," said Nancy, glancing uneasily round, as she had scarcely ceased to do since she began to speak, for a vision of Sikes haunted her perpetually. "And more, When he spoke of you and the other lady, and said it seemed contrived by heaven, or the devil, against him, that Oliver should come into your hands, he laughed, and said that there was some comfort in that too, for how many thousands and hundreds of thousands of pounds would you not give, if you had them, to know who your two-legged spaniel was? You do not mean, said Rose, turning very pale, to tell me that this was said in earnest? He spoke in hard and angry earnest, if a man ever did, replied the girl, shaking her head. He is an earnest man when his hatred is up. I know many who do worse things, but I'd rather listen to them all a dozen times than to that monk's once. It is growing late, and I have to reach home without suspicion of having been on such an errand as this. I must get back quickly. But what can I do? Said Rose. To what use can I turn this communication without you? Back? Why do you wish to return to the companions you paint in such terrible colours? If you repeat this information to a gentleman whom I can summon in an instant from the next room, you can be consigned to some place of safety without half an hour's delay. I wish to go back, said the girl. I must go back because... How can I tell such things to an innocent lady like you? Because among the men I have told you of, there is one, the most desperate among them all, that I can't leave. No, not even to be saved from the life I am leading now. Your having interfered in this dear boy's behalf before, said Rose, your coming here at so great a risk to tell me what you have heard, your manner, which convinces me of the truth of what you say, your evident contrition and sense of shame, all lead me to believe that you might yet be reclaimed. Oh, said the earnest girl, folding her hands as the tears coursed down her face, do not turn a deaf ear to the entreaties of one of your own sex. The first, I do believe, who ever appealed to you in the voice of pity and compassion. Do hear my words, and let me save you yet for better things. Lady, cried the girl, sinking on her knees, dear, sweet, angel lady, you are the first that ever blessed me with such words as these, and if I had heard them many years ago, they might have turned me from a life of sin and sorrow. But it is too late. It is too late. It is never too late, said Rose, for penitence and atonement. It is, cried the girl, writhing in the agony of her mind. I cannot leave him now. I could not be his death. Why should you be? Asked Rose. Nothing could save him, cried the girl. If I told others what I have told you, and led to their being taken, he would be sure to die. He is the boldest, and has been so cruel. Is it possible, cried Rose, that for such a man as this you can resign every future hope, and the certainty of immediate rescue? It is madness. I don't know what it is, answered the girl. I only know that it is so, and not with me alone, but with hundreds of others as bad and wretched as myself. I must go back. Whether it is God's wrath for the wrong I have done, I do not know, but I am drawn back to him through every suffering and ill usage, and I should be, I believe, if I knew I was going to die by his hand at last. What am I to do? Said Rose. I should not let you depart from me thus. You should, lady, and I know you will, rejoined the girl, rising. You will not stop my going because I have trusted in your goodness, and forced no promise from you, as I might have done. Of what use, then, is the communication you have made? Said Rose. This mystery must be investigated, or how will its disclosure to me benefit Oliver, whom you are anxious to serve? You must have some kind gentleman about that will hear it as a secret and advise you what to do, rejoined the girl. But where can I find you again when it is necessary? Asked Rose. I do not seek to know where these dreadful people live, but where will you be walking or passing at any settled period from this time? Will you promise me that you will have my secret strictly kept, and come alone, or with the only other person that knows it, and that I shall not be watched or followed? Asked the girl. I promise you solemnly, answered Rose. Every Sunday night, from 11 till the clock strikes 12, said the girl without hesitation, I will walk on London Bridge if I am alive. Stay another moment, interposed Rose, as the girl moved hurriedly towards the door. Think once again on your own condition, and the opportunity you have of escaping from it. You have a claim on me, not only as the voluntary bearer of this intelligence, but as a woman lost almost beyond redemption. Will you return to this gang of robbers and to this man, when a word can save you? What fascination is it that can take you back, and make you cling to wickedness and misery? Oh, is there no chord in your heart that I can touch? Is there nothing left to which I can appeal against this terrible infatuation? When ladies as young and good and beautiful as you are, replied the girl steadily, give away your arts, love will carry you all lengths. even such as you, who have home, friends, other admirers, everything to fill them. When such as I, who have no certain roof but a coffin lid, and no friends in sickness or death but the hospital nurse, set our rotten hearts on any man, and let him fill the place that has been blank through all our wretched lives, who can hope to cure us? Pity us, lady, pity us for having only one feeling of the woman left, and for having that turned by heavy judgment from a comfort and a pride into a new means of violence and suffering. You will, said Rose after a pause, take some money from me, which may enable you to live without dishonesty, at all events until we meet again. Not a penny, replied the girl, waving her hand. Do not close your heart against all my efforts to help you, said Rose, stepping gently forward. I wish to serve you indeed. You would serve me best, lady, replied the girl, wringing her hands, if you could take my life at once, for I felt more grief to think of what I am tonight than I ever did before, and it would be something not to die in the hell in which I have lived. God bless you, sweet lady, and send as much happiness on your head as I have brought shame on mine. Thus speaking, and sobbing aloud, the unhappy creature turned away, while Rose Maylie, overpowered by this extraordinary interview, which had more the semblance of a rapid dream than an actual occurrence, sank into a chair and endeavoured to collect her wandering thoughts. End of chapter 40.